Good afternoon. The 9,027th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of the Council, Ambassador Barbara Woodward, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom, for her service as President of the Council for the month of April. I would like to express the Council's appreciation to Ambassador Woodward and her team for the skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. Thank you, Barbara. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Greece, Italy, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Piotr Glinski, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan, Advocacy Coordinator, Right to Protection. It is so decided. Mr. Griffiths, Ms. Bachelet, and Ms. Luzan are joining today's meeting via video teleconference. The Secretary General will now begin its the Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on the agenda. And I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. António Guterres, and give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, I welcome this opportunity to address the Security Council on my recent visit to the Russian Federation and Ukraine, where I met with President Putin and President Zelensky on the 26th and the 28th of April, respectively. As part of my regional visit, I also had discussions with President Erdogan in Ankara and President Duda in Rzeszów, Poland. Throughout my travels, I did not mince words. I said the same thing in Moscow as I did in Kyiv, which is exactly what I have repeatedly expressed in New York, namely that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and of the Charter of the United Nations, and that it must end for the sake of the people of Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world. Madam President, I visited Moscow and Kyiv with a clear understanding of the realities on the ground. I entered an active war zone in Ukraine with no immediate possibility of a national ceasefire and a full-scale ongoing attack on the east of the country. Before the visit, the Ukrainian government issued an appeal to the United Nations and to me personally, expressed publicly by the Deputy Prime Minister, regarding the dire plight of civilians in the devastated city of Mariupol and specifically the Azovstal plant. In my meeting with President Putin, I therefore stressed the imperative enabling humanitarian access and evacuations from besieged areas, including first and foremost Mariupol. I strongly urged the opening of a safe and effective humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to reach safety from the Azovstal plant. A short time later, I received confirmation of an agreement in principle. We immediately followed up with intense preparatory work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, along with Russian and Ukrainian authorities. Our objective was to initially enable the safe evacuation of those civilians from the Azovstal plant, and later the rest of the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver humanitarian aid. I am pleased to report on some measure of success. Together, the United Nations and the ICRC are leading a humanitarian operation of great complexity, both politically and in terms of security. It began on 29 April and has required enormous coordination and advocacy with the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian authorities. So far, 2 safe passage convoys have been successfully completed. In the first, concluded on 3 May, 101 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant, along with 59 more from a neighboring area. In the second operation, completed last night, more than 320 civilians were evacuated from the city of Mariupol and surrounding areas. A third operation is underway, but it is our policy not to speak about the details of any of them before they are completed to avoid undermining possible success. It is good to know that even in these times of hyper-communications, silent diplomacy is still possible and is sometimes the only effective way to produce results. So far in total, nearly 500 civilians found long-awaited relief after living under relentless shelling and scarce availability of water, food and sanitation. The evacuees have shared moving tales with UN staff. Mothers, children and frail grandparents spoke of their trauma. Some were in urgent need of medical attention. I hope that the continued coordination with Moscow and Kyiv will lead to more humanitarian pauses to allow civilians safe passage from the fighting and aid to reach those in critical needs. We must continue to do all we can to get people out of these hellscapes. Under Secretary General and the Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths will brief you today in greater detail on the latest efforts in Mariupol and additional steps. High Commissioner Bachelet will brief on reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, possible war crimes, and the need for accountability. As I discussed yesterday with President Zelensky, the UN will continue to scale up humanitarian operations, save lives, and reduce suffering. Madam President, my meetings with both leaders also focused on the crucial issue of global food security. And indeed, the worldwide implications of this war were in full view in my subsequent travels to West Africa. In Senegal, Niger and Nigeria, I heard direct testimony from leaders and civil society on how the war is unleashing a food security crisis. We need quick and decisive action to ensure a steady flow of food and energy in open markets by lifting export restrictions, allocating surpluses and reserves to those who need them, and addressing food price increase to calm market volatility. But let me be clear, a meaningful solution to global food insecurity requires reintegrating Ukraine's agricultural production and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war. I will do my best to help facilitate a dialogue to help make this a reality. At the same time, the war in Ukraine in all its dimensions is setting in motion a crisis that is also devastating global energy markets, disrupting financial systems, and exacerbating extreme vulnerabilities for the developing world. That is precisely why I established the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance to mobilize UN agencies, multilateral development banks, and other international institutions to help countries face these challenges. We were particularly engaged in making proposals at the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Madam President, Excellencies, the war on Ukraine is senseless in scope, restless in its dimensions, and limitless in its potential for global harm. The cycle of death, destruction, dislocation, and disruption must stop. It is high time to unite and end this war and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Linda, Madam President, thank you very much indeed. As we've just heard from the Secretary General, elements of diplomatic progress are coming into view even as civilian suffering mounts. So I'll speak briefly today, if I may, about the human toll of this war, and then about what we're doing to address humanitarian needs, including a short update on our latest operations. And I know that High Commissioner Bachelet will, of course, detail the impact on civilians for you, so I will be brief. Just to recap, the destruction of civilian infrastructure has come to characterize this conflict. Apartment buildings, schools, and hospitals in populated areas have been attacked, and they must not be so. Over 13 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, of whom 7.7 million are displaced inside Ukraine. Lives have been uprooted, ripped apart, and never will be the same again. And many others couldn't run. Often the most vulnerable are simply stuck. The elderly, people with disabilities have been unable to seek shelter from bombs, get out to gather supplies, or receive information on evacuations. And the threat of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and human trafficking, as I'm sure we will hear from the other briefers, risen hugely since the war began. Allegations of sexual violence against women, girls, men, and boys are mounting. Roads, as we've all seen, are heavily contaminated with explosive ordnance, putting civilians at risk and stopping humanitarian convoys from reaching them. Madam President, let me briefly brief you on what the UN and our humanitarian partners are trying to do inside Ukraine to meet these growing needs. We have now 217 humanitarian partners with whom we are working in Ukraine. And I think we have now scaled up at record speed. We have more than 1,400 staff, UN staff, deployed across the country, operating out of 8 hubs beyond Kyiv, with staff, warehouses, and supplies in 30 locations, principally, of course, across the east, where the war is happening and the needs are greatest. We reach more than 4.1 million people with some form of assistance on a daily basis across all the country's 24 oblasts. Our humanitarian response has 3 main aspects. First, we deliver a great deal of humanitarian assistance and protection services to displaced people, and I know it's not enough, and I'm sure it's adequate, and I know we'll hear more on that. But that's all across the country, especially where internally displaced people have sought safety, or where people have begun returning, a crucial new element, to severely damaged communities. And when I was in Irpin just a few weeks ago, the mayor was describing to us, as he, I think, described to the Secretary General, how his people are trying to get back to Irpin, but to do so, the reconstruction will take, as he's put it, 1.5 years. So restoring basic services necessary to survive is key. And I was very struck by the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross very, very quickly after the conversation I'd had, but not as a result of that, went in to repair the basic services element for the population of Irpin to be able to return. In these areas, injecting cash aid allows civilians to choose what they need and offers a modicum of dignity in these fractious times. It helps to keep markets open and liquidity and supply chains moving. We plan to reach 1.3 million people with cash assistance, plugging into Ukraine's social protection system with top-up payments, working with the government, working with the Prime Minister and his plans for the distribution of cash to his people to reach family at risk. This is needed technical liaison, but it's now largely achieved. Cash-based aid will now scale up very, very quickly indeed. A second part, that's the first part. The second part of our response is working on pre-positioning supplies to forward operating bases and increasing our preparedness in areas to where we imagine this war might move next. And third, and we've heard from the Secretary General, we engage every single day with parties to the conflict to push for the movement of aid to civilians in areas of active conflict or to negotiate to help civilians leave for safer areas. We have been able, Madam President, so far to stage 5 interagency aid convoys to some of the hardest hit areas, operations which required a humanitarian notification system to both parties to allow for those safe passage movements. They've been a lifeline, a small mercy perhaps, to civilians encircled by fighting, bringing in medical supplies, water, food rations, non-food items, and so forth. But it's a beginning, but hopefully it's not an end. And as the Secretary General has described, as a result of his own efforts, we've seen a glimmer of hope in these past days, thanks to his efforts and those of our colleagues on the front line. As you know, on May the 2nd, more than 100 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, including women, children, and older people. About 60 more people joined that convoy on the outskirts of Mariupol and were then able to move to safety. And it was, as the Secretary General has described, a project of the greatest complexity and of constant oversight, and it was an exceptional operation. I'm especially grateful. I'd like to record here our thanks to the International Committee of the Red Cross and the leadership of Peter Mara, as well as to our own highly experienced first responders. But I must also applaud the authorities and it's essentially the respective militaries of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation for their close and constructive and essential cooperation in making that operation a reality. It showed us that that can happen. And I believe, though the numbers weren't great, that a single life saved is worth every ounce of effort. And as of yesterday, as the Secretary General said, we were able to move more than 320 civilians out of the Mariupol area broadly, again working closely in lockstep with ICRC and with the cooperation of the Ukrainian and the Russian authorities. And today we have that third operation, which began this morning with the intent of evacuating civilians from Mariupol and Azovstal. And as he said, we prefer not to speak about that operation until it is complete. What I can finally say about this is we're seeing the fruits of our labor over these past many weeks of establishing a liaison in Moscow, of the visits that preceded the Secretary General and which were brought into fruition by his own long and detailed meetings with the leaderships of both sides in this last week. We are beginning to see now the agreement on local ceasefires, because none of these movements of safe passage will happen without local ceasefires, pauses, windows of silence. So we're making some progress, and we're building relations, and we're building experience, which we hope we can then broaden to more such operations. And that is the third element of our humanitarian program. We'll keep pushing for more civilians to be able to leave Mariupol and indeed Azovstal if they so choose. And we'll now begin on that basis to explore options for reaching others where the need is greatest and where we need and desire to serve the people of Ukraine in their hour of direst need. Madam President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Madam President, Excellencies, for over 8 years, since 15 March 2014, my office, through the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, has been monitoring the situation in Ukraine. To date, we have released close to 50 periodic and thematic reports. On the 24th of February 2022, we quickly adapted to a very different working environment. Like millions of Ukrainians, the staff of my office relocated to other regions in the country, but, and I'm very proud to say, have not paused their work for a single day. Currently, the mission has staff on the ground in Uzhgorod, Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro, Donetsk, and Odessa, and conducts field visits to various parts of the country, including Kyiv and Chernihiv region just last week. The mission continues to verify allegations of violations of international human rights law and of international humanitarian law in the context of the Russian Federation's armed attack on Ukraine. Many of these allegations concern violations that may amount to war crimes. Based on the mission work, my office updated the UN Human Rights Council at the end of March and will present a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine covering the period from 24 February to 15 May at the next session of the Council in June. And my press statement on Ukraine on the 22nd of April summarized our most recent findings. It pains me to say that all our concerns remain valid and the situation keeps deteriorating. Madam President, today is the 71st day of the escalation of the hostilities, expanding the already 8-year-long conflict to all regions of the country. Reports of deadly incidents, such as attacks on Hospital Number 3 and the Drama Theater in Mariupol, on the railway station in Kramatorsk, on residential areas in Odessa, have become shockingly frequent. There seems to be no end in sight to the daily reports of civilian death and injuries. My team on the ground conveys the palpable trauma and shock experienced by people they speak with, the vast majority of whom have either personally witnessed a violation or are victims themselves. Rather than try to describe what victims are going through, let me use their words. Residents of Mariupol set up a Telegram channel to share information about their relatives who perished in the city, and I will quote them. He was killed in front of his wife and children. Her body remained under the debris of her house. We could not even bury her. My uncle died from loss of blood after sustaining fragmentation injuries. I only know he was buried in a collective grave. I could share many more such messages. Last week, on the 28th of April, when the UN Secretary General was visiting Kyiv to meet the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the city was hit by 2 missiles. At least 1 woman, a journalist, was killed, and 4 civilians were injured in the attack. An OSCHR team was in Kyiv on that day too, preparing to visit Busha. On the same day, we corroborated 22 civilian deaths and 40 civilian injuries in other places of Ukraine. Members of the Council, in Ukraine, my office has recorded 6,731 civilian casualties since the 24th of February. We know the real figures are considerably higher. As my office consistently reports, most of these casualties have been caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes. My office is also documenting the devastating consequences of the conflict on other human rights. In areas around Kyiv from late February for about 5 weeks, Russian forces targeted male civilians who they considered suspicious. Men that were detained, beaten, summarily executed, and in some cases taken to Belarus and Russia, unbeknownst to their families and held in pretrial detention facilities. My staff met with families who are searching for their missing male relatives, desperate to know where they are, if they are alive, or how they can get them back. Families were shot as they tried to escape in convoys. In some areas, it was dangerous to cross the street with snipers or soldiers shooting at anyone who tried. Local authorities are compiling lists of deaths and missing, continuing exhumations, taking DNA from relatives, while also trying to reconnect districts to electricity and water. In other areas controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, such as Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, we continue to document arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearances of representatives of local authorities, journalists, civil society activists, retired servicemen, and the armed forces, and other civilians by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. As of 4th of May, my office has documented 180 such cases, of which 5 victims were eventually found dead. We have also documented 8 possible enforced disappearances of people considered to be pro-Russian in government-controlled territory. My staff heard about cases of women having been raped by Russian armed forces in areas that were under their control, as well as other allegations of sexual violence by both parties to the conflict. And yet, the stigma around rape and sexual violence continues to prevent victims and their families from feeling safe to report. This only highlights the importance of ensuring adequate and safe support services for victims. Grim evidence of torture, ill treatment, and summary executions of prisoners of war committed by both parties to the conflict is surfacing. My office is collecting such evidence, which will be included in its future reporting. The only way for these horrors to stop is for armed forces to fully respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. It is vital that all parties give clear instruction to their combatants to protect civilians and persons hors de combat, as well as to distinguish between civilian and military objects. Those in command of armed forces must make it clear to their members that anyone found to have been involved in such violations will be prosecuted and held accountable. Accountability demands that evidence be preserved and that mortal remains be treated with decency. Madam President, members of the Council, the list of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law continues to grow each day, and we cannot let the number of victims continue to rise. A one-day ceasefire alone would spare the lives of at least 50 civilian children, women, and men, including many older persons. A one-day ceasefire would prevent 30 to 70 civilians from being injured and a dozen from becoming disabled. A one-day ceasefire would allow several thousand civilians to safely leave areas where they are currently trapped in hostilities. Most importantly, a ceasefire will show that the horror in Ukraine can be stopped. It is of the most fundamental importance that the ongoing hostilities cease once and for all. Madam President, advocating for accountability is a cornerstone of my office work. If the perpetrators of violations against civilians and persons hors de combat are brought to justice, potential perpetrators will think twice before unleashing similar unlawful attacks or acts of violence and creating new victims. Accountability also contributes to the healing process for the victims, the family, and the society at large. National justice systems are the most crucial. I urge the parties to the conflict to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law allegedly committed by the armed forces, and I welcome Ukraine's efforts in this regard. My office is fully committed to supporting those systems and the work of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and to cooperating with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and other international justice mechanisms in accordance with our established UN frameworks. Let us commit to putting a stop to this senseless conflict. We must be steadfast in our efforts for peace and resolute that justice will be done. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Bachelet for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Tatiana Lizan.
Thank you, Madam President. It is a great honor to represent today's civil society that mobilized the first hours after the full-scale Russian invasion of February 24, as they did before, for 8 years of the war. Our joint efforts are aimed at supporting brave Ukrainians, fighting at the forefront, as well as in public offices in Lviv, Kyiv, and Kramatorsk. These are volunteers, municipal workers planting flowers in Kharkiv and other cities in Ukraine under heavy shelling, railway workers evacuating people away from hostilities and death, bakers, cashiers at groceries, and all people affected by the war. All Ukrainians are now beating as one big heart. In the chaos of war, no one should be left behind. People, their lives and health, honor, dignity, and security shall always remain the highest value. In order to maintain this goal, Ukraine and the whole civilized world shall face immense challenges caused by the military invasion of the Russian Federation. The war has been lasting for 8 years. In 2021, the number of IDPs in Ukraine fleeing occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions officially was almost 1.5 million. At the end of April, the International Organization for Migration informed that the number of internally displaced persons as a result of the full-scale invasion of the territory of Ukraine reached 7.7 million. They all carried the same heavy burden of displacement. They all need equal protection. Also, should not be forgotten those Ukrainians who were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation, from Mariupol, Chernihiv, Severodonetsk, and other cities and villages. These people were forcibly displaced without documents and means of communication, exposed to the filtration by the Russian Federation. Within these 2 last months, over 1 million people overall, and around 200,000 children among them, were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation from Ukraine. It must be ensured that those who are willing to come back to Ukraine or travel to other countries have the possibility to do so. Challenges that children and their parents experience in the face of war are overwhelming. Right to Protection received calls via our hotline where parents were ready to send their children abroad with complete strangers, out of desperation because of the Russian atrocities happening in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other cities. The world was shaken with stories of little boys, aged even 4 or 5, crossing the state border alone, or in the best case scenario with very familiar people. Ukraine, as well as accepting countries, shall resume responsibility over these vulnerable little Ukrainians, so that the children are safely crossing the state borders, supported by specifically trained state guard officers and child service representatives. The accepting countries shall guarantee a high level of their protection. Family reunification should be presumed, and they are safe and timely return to Ukraine after the end of the war must be ensured. The number of killed and injured civilians is permanently increasing. The destinies of dozens of thousands of people in Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Irpin are unknown. Relatives cannot always prove the death of their beloved, even if they witnessed their last moments themselves. International community shall assist the government of Ukraine in establishing and enforcing appropriate measures of investigation and prosecution, since each life is priceless, and relatives deserve to know the truth. I want to mention those Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine seeking safety and security in the European Union and other countries in the civilized world. These Ukrainians, overwhelming majority women and children, should not be overlooked in terms of observance of their rights, shelter, human trafficking, access to service, including psychological help. Stateless persons and third country nationals who had previously found refuge in Ukraine shall be granted protection along with the Ukrainians. Finally, of paramount importance is to recall the immense number of IDPs, many of whom may not have a roof over their heads. In many cases, the conditions of temporary accommodation do not comply with basic rules of adequate shelter. IDPs live in collective or transit centers established in schools, places of common use often not designed for stay during cold times. Over 32 million square meters of housing property were destroyed, damaged, or occupied. Despite the massive destruction, as the whole world has seen in Bucha, Irpin, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, thousands of civilians either returned back or never left their damaged homes. All of them urgently need adequate temporary or permanent accommodation, especially for the cold autumn and winter periods. Those who chose not to leave their damaged homes shall receive the much needed tangible support, such as the construction materials and tools, plastic wrap, and physical help. Additionally, such unprecedented massive destruction of civilian infrastructure requires durable solutions from the Ukrainian authorities with support of the international community. We call on all members of the Security Council, international organizations, and governments to support Ukrainians firmly in these dark times. In the name of millions of people who have died, unborn, survived, residents of Ukraine, a UN member since 1945, we require to rephrase and breathe new sense in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. for living in peace. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Lozan for her briefing. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and may I start by congratulating the UK presidency for their excellent stewardship of the Council during the month of April, and wish you, Madam President and dear Linda, as well as the US team, the very best for this month. I'd like also to thank the Secretary General for his remarks, for his clear positioning in upholding the international law, and even more so for his efforts to negotiate a safe passage for civilians in Mariupol during his recent visit to Russia and Ukraine. We all must be proud of what the UN system is doing to help Ukraine and its people. I'd like also to thank USG Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet and Ms. Luzan for their important and updated information, yet a sobering one. Madam President, the absurd, unprovoked, unjustified and still going on war of choice of Russia and Ukraine is in its 3rd month. While Russia continues to be immured in total denial, the world continues to witness a never-ending human tragedy. Despite worldwide calls, there is no end in sight. Calls for a humanitarian pause during Orthodox Easter were unheeded. The war continues to inflict undue pain on Ukraine and its people. Indiscriminate shelling and bombing of population areas, the killing of civilians and attacks on health facilities, schools and civilian infrastructure continue. Extrajudicial killings, sexual violence and rape, actions that may amount to war crimes have been documented and are mounting, as we heard by USG Griffiths. Eastern and southern parts of Ukraine are now facing severe consequences, while airstrikes continued in multiple areas in Ukraine, causing additional damage and civilian losses. Every time we meet here, there are new reports of casualties, news of more atrocities uncovered, and more destruction inflicted. Just like that apartment hit in Odessa, killing 8 civilians, including a 3-month-old baby, or those dreadful accounts just mentioned by the High Commissioner Bachelet. But Russia's actions are not limited in Ukraine only. More than 5 million people have been forced to cross the borders. No one could have imagined how quickly the world's bread basket could go from wheat fields to battlefields. Global hunger is soaring to alarming levels, exacerbated like never before by this war that is destroying a country, that is aggressing developing countries, and is challenging the entire world. Dear colleagues, 1,200 bodies have been discovered so far around Kiev, and almost all civilians killed by a bullet in the head. You remember, Kremlin considered Ukrainians as brothers, and yet it is killing them. When you kill your family, you are a monster. Soldiers have tortured, raped, and murdered only to be honored for their bravery. They should be called to account, not celebrated. As Russia stalls and keeps redrawing its strategy, all indicates that disabused commanders have abandoned military doctrine, and to prove any form of success are flattening cities and terrorizing civilians. This is the victory à la Russe. When you cannot prevail on the battlefield, you resort to atrocities, a terrible match of incompetence with brutality. This is a cruel reality and a dreadful prospect. Madam President, the more Russia struggles in front of Ukraine's resistance, the more Kremlin's rhetoric continues to escalate into the madman's idea of nuclear war. Nuclear saber-rattling is ignominious. Once it was the president himself, then another official, and then the unstoppable propaganda machine. What is the purpose of showing in the TV a nuclear weapon that could trigger a tsunami strong enough to flood the entire UK? What is the logic of staging a nuclear explosion in the heart of Ireland? There could not be a more striking contrast between dreams and projects of science for conquering space and extending human civilization beyond the planet, and this archaic and rotted rhetoric of the possible use of weapons of mass destruction, of annihilation of civilization because of the war of choice that is being lost. Leon Trotsky has written, and I quote, "The army is a copy of society and suffers from all its diseases, usually at a higher temperature." This is why truth is critical, so that the domestic and international opinion does not fall for the propaganda and the conspiracy theories vehiculated relentlessly from a black hole from where only darkness is escaping. Only yesterday we celebrated World Press Freedom Day, and I'd like to pay tribute to all the brave journalists that are risking their lives to tell the truth, to keep the world informed about the war in Ukraine. Russian citizens must learn that this war is not glorifying their country. It has isolated it like never before. It is not making it more prosperous. To the contrary, it is vertiginously spiraling it down. It is not transporting it to modernity, but rather dragging it into a revolved past. No one wants to destroy Russia. No one wants to cancel Russia. If Kremlin has made bad choices and taken wrong decisions, they can correct the course, which means stop the war, recall troops back home, choose reason, return to diplomacy, respect their neighbor, and let that big Ukraine heart beat in freedom, as Ms. Luzin mentioned. This is what is needed. The key word here is mir. Madam President, after several failed attempts, safe passage was arduously secured for a number of civilians in Mariupol steel facility, which, as we heard, are underway. This is a testimony, a welcome, but a meager one comparing the scale of tragedy in Ukraine, that diplomacy, vocal or silent, can work, but there must be a will. Those lucky ones that would see the sun again after weeks in the underground to escape relentless shelling tell that before being escorted to non-occupied parts of Ukraine, they had been interrogated by FSB agents seeking information on the tunnels of Azovstal steel complex with a view to locating Ukrainian soldiers still in that only part of Mariupol not occupied by the Russian forces. And occupied means destroyed. Only 2 months ago, Mariupol was a thriving city with almost 500,000 inhabitants. The scorched earth strategy applied by Russia has made it the catacomb of Ukraine. Madam President, we know now the main mantra of the pretext of the war was invasion of Ukraine is to denazify the country. Despite the fact that the first citizen, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. Yet the theory has been further elaborated. Pretending that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews, that Hitler had Jewish blood, which underlines the theory that Jews inflicted the Holocaust to themselves, just like the Ukrainians are supposedly slaughtering their people and destroying their own country. This is not black humor. This is not one of those basic fake news you easily discard as rubbish. This is part of the worst conspiracy theory warfare. And when you have the top diplomat dwell on such disgracefulness, this is a terrible low coming from a very dangerous high. Madam President, we are not in the business of competition who speaks more or louder. We are here to try to stop this war, to stop those crimes, protect civilians, and to make sure that the perpetrators do not have a place in our world, but only in theirs, the one where they pay for their deeds through accountability. We welcome the huge efforts of the European Union to respond to the massive increase in humanitarian needs in providing military, financial, and other support for the reconstruction. We welcome the high-level International Donors Conference for Ukraine held today in Warsaw, and Albania made a commitment, took part and made a commitment there. Madam President, the Secretary General, as we heard, was received in Moscow for uneasy talks with authorities. He also visited Kiev. As appalling and as shameful it may be, Kiev was shelled during his visit and while he was speaking. Rarely have we witnessed such a degree of disregard for the UN and its Secretary General, such contempt for the organization and the entire UN personnel. I don't know how the Russians explain this, unless in the very same way as for everything else, the Ukrainians did it. Let me end with this note. We should strongly reject any idea of territorial division of Ukraine imposed by force as a result of aggression. We have mentioned it before and we reiterate it now. The creation of artificial entities, either by occupation or by proxies, is unacceptable. That should not be accepted in Ukraine or anywhere else. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora
Thank you very much,
Presidenta.
Madam President.
Felicito al Reino
I
Unido por su
congratulate the
presidencia el
United
mes
Kingdom
pasado
for its presidency
y
last
le
month,
deseo a los Estados
and
Unidos
I wish the
el mayor
United
de los
States
éxitos
every
durante su
success
presidencia
during its
este
presidency
mes.
this month.
Agradezco al
I
secretario general
thank
António
Secretary General
Guterres,
António
a la
Guterres,
alta comisionada
the High
Michelle Bachelet,
Commissioner
al
Michelle
secretario
Bachelet,
general adjunto Martin Griffiths y a la
Undersecretary
señora
General
Tatiana
Martin Griffiths,
Luzán
and
por
Ms.
sus
Tatiana Luzan
presentaciones
for
el día de
their
hoy.
briefings today.
Empiezo por
I
reconocer
begin
los
by
esfuerzos del
recognizing
secretario
the
general
efforts of the
durante
Secretary
su
General
reciente misión
during
a
his
Rusia y
recent
Ucrania,
mission to Russia and
que, entre
Ukraine,
otros,
which, inter alia,
permitió la evacuación
enabled
de un
the
número
evacuation of
considerable
a
de
considerable
civiles
number of
que se hallaban
civilians
en
that found
condiciones muy
themselves
críticas
in extremely
en la
critical
planta de
conditions
Azovstal
in the
en Mariupol.
Azovstal plant in
En
Mariupol.
ese contexto,
In this
resulta
context,
también encomiable la labor
the
del
work
Comité
of the
Internacional de la
International
Cruz Roja.
Committee of the Red Cross
La
is also
asistencia
commendable.
humanitaria
Humanitarian
debe seguir
assistance
siendo
must
nuestra
continue to
prioridad
be our
a
priority
través de la
through the implementation of
resolución
Resolution
ES 11/2
ES11/2
adoptada el
adopted
pasado 24
on
de
the
marzo
24th
por la
of
Asamblea
March this
General.
year by the General Assembly.
Respaldamos al secretario general
We
en
support the
sus buenos
Secretary General
oficios
in his
y en
good
su trabajo
offices and
diplomático para
in his diplomatic
lograr una
work to
solución
achieve
pacífica a
a
este
peaceful
conflicto
solution to this
que dura ya
conflict,
más de 10
which has already
semanas
lasted more than
y que ha
10
tenido
weeks and
gravísimas
which has had
consecuencias
very
en la
grave
población civil
consequences
ucraniana
for the
y
Ukrainian
cuyas
civilian population
repercusiones a
and
nivel
whose
mundial
repercussions at a global level
empiezan
are
a tener
beginning
ya
to
un duro
already
impacto.
have a harsh impact.
En tanto no se logre un cese a las
While a
hostilidades
cession of
y
hostilities
se
is
avance
not
hacia una
reached
solución
and progress is made
diplomática,
towards a
el
diplomatic
objetivo
solution,
debe ser
the objective
brindar
must
con
be to
urgencia la ayuda
urgently
humanitaria
provide the
requerida
required
y
humanitarian aid
proteger a la
and
población
protect
civil
the
y a la
civilian
infraestructura
population
que se
and the
requiere
infrastructure that is
para
needed
satisfacer
to
sus
meet
necesidades básicas.
basic needs.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam
los
President,
números que nos han compartido
the
en relación
numbers
a las
that have been
víctimas,
shared with us with
los
regard to the
daños
numbers of
y los
victims
costos que ha
and
dejado
the
este
harm
conflicto
and
hasta
the
la fecha
cost caused by this
son
conflict to date
alarmantes.
are
Y lo
alarming.
más lamentable es
And
que
the most
probablemente las
regrettable
cifras
is
reales
that it is
sean
likely
aún
that the real
más
figures will
onerosas.
be even greater.
Hace un año, este
1 year
Consejo
ago, this
adoptó de
Council
manera unánime la
unanimously
resolución
adopted Resolution
2573 que
2573.
exige a
This
todas las
resolution
partes
calls
en
on
los
all
conflictos
parties
armados
to armed conflicts
cumplir
to
plenamente sus
fully abide
obligaciones
by
en
their
virtud
obligations
del
under
derecho
international
internacional humanitario.
humanitarian law.
Es
It
inadmisible
is
que la
inadmissible,
Organización Mundial de la
as
Salud
reported by the World Health
reporte que
Organization,
en lo que va del
that
conflicto
so far
se
in the
hayan registrado
conflict,
186 ataques
186
en
attacks
contra de
against
instalaciones
health
sanitarias
facilities and
u
hospitals have
hospitalarias.
already been recorded.
Adicionalmente, debemos
In
deplorar
addition,
también los
we
ataques
further
registrados contra
deplore
escuelas,
the attacks
presas,
against schools,
estaciones de tren,
dams, railway
almacenes
stations,
de alimentos y
food
viviendas,
storage facilities and
entre
housing,
otros,
inter
que
alia.
ponen en evidencia el
These
total
highlight
desacato al
the
derecho
total
internacional
disregard for
humanitario.
international humanitarian law.
Reiteramos una vez más
Once again, we
la obligación de
reiterate the
distinguir
obligation to
entre la
distinguish
población y los
between
bienes civiles por una
civilian
parte
populations and
y
civilian
los
property on the one
combatientes y
hand
los
and
objetivos
combatants
militares
and military
por la
targets
otra.
on the other.
No es permisible
It is not
atacar,
acceptable to
destruir o
attack,
inutilizar
destroy,
bienes
or
indispensables para
cripple
la
crucial
sobrevivencia de la
assets for the
población
survival
civil,
of the civilian
lo cual
population.
resulta aún más trágico
This is
cuando
all the more
ocurre
tragic
en el
when it
contexto de
happens in the
grandes y
context of
crecientes
great and
necesidades
growing
humanitarias.
humanitarian needs.
México seguirá con atención
Mexico
los
will
desarrollos en
follow
torno a la
closely the
investigación
developments
anunciada
on the
por el fiscal de
investigation
la
announced
Corte
by the
Penal
prosecutor of
Internacional
the International
sobre
Criminal
la
Court on the
situación en
situation in Ukraine.
Dichas investigaciones son
Such investigations are
fundamentales, toda vez
fundamental,
que el
not
derecho
least because
internacional
international
es el
law
sustento
is
de esta
the
organización,
foundation of this
pero lo es
organization,
también del
as it is
multilateralismo
also of
y de toda forma de
multilateralism
convivencia
and any
respetuosa
form of
entre
respectful
Estados
coexistence
soberanos.
between sovereign states.
Todas las partes están obligadas a
All
respetar
parties are
las
obliged
obligaciones
to
emanadas de
respect
la
the
Carta de las
obligations
Naciones
arising from the
Unidas,
Charter of the
de
United
los
Nations
diversos tratados
and from the
y de
various
otras
treaties
fuentes del
and other
derecho
sources of international
internacional
law,
y en particular
and in
del derecho
particular
internacional de los derechos
international
humanos
human rights
y
law
del derecho
and
internacional
international humanitarian
humanitario.
law.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam
la
President,
posición de México ha
Mexico's
sido
position has
inequívoca.
been unequivocal.
Abogamos por una
We
diplomacia
call
preventiva.
for preventive diplomacy.
Favorecemos el diálogo y
We
una solución
favor
política
dialogue and a
con
political
base en el derecho
solution based
internacional
on
y
international
sobre
law,
todo
and above
por
all,
poner a las
to
personas
put
en el centro
people
de la
at the
acción
heart
de
of
este
this
Consejo,
Council's action,
sin excepciones
without
y
exceptions,
sin condiciones.
without conditions.
Seguiremos llamando al cese
We will
inmediato de
continue
las
calling for an
hostilidades,
immediate cessation of
pues
hostilities,
esta es
because
la más
this
alta de
is
todas las prioridades.
the highest of all
Seguimos
priorities.
con atención las ordenanzas
We
de la Corte
follow
Internacional de
closely the
Justicia
ordinances of the
y
International
las pesquisas del
Court of
fiscal
Justice
de la
and the
Corte Penal
investigations of the prosecutor of the
Internacional.
International Criminal Court.
Reiteramos que todos
We
los estados,
reiterate
al haber
that all
ratificado la Carta de
states,
las Naciones
in
Unidas,
ratifying the
nos
United Nations
comprometimos a
Charter,
respetar la
committed to
soberanía,
respecting
la
the
independencia
sovereignty,
política
political
y la
independence,
integridad
and territorial
territorial de los
integrity of
estados.
states.
Ucrania
Ukraine
no puede ser
cannot be
excepción.
an exception to this.
Mi delegación seguirá
My
impulsando
delegation will
todo aquello que
continue
permita
encouraging
el acceso
everything that
irrestricto a la
enables unhindered
asistencia
access for
humanitaria
humanitarian
e
assistance.
insistimos
And
en la imperante
we
necesidad
insist on the
de que el
overwhelming
Consejo
need
de
for the
Seguridad
Security Council
salga de
to
la parálisis de la
overcome
que ha sido
the
rehén
paralysis that has
y
held it
pueda cumplir con
hostage,
sus
and for it to be able
responsabilidades,
to shoulder its
parar la
responsibilities,
guerra
to stop the
y
war
restaurar la paz
and to
en
restore
Ucrania.
peace in Ukraine.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
je remercie
I wish
le
to
secrétaire
thank the
général
Secretary General,
ainsi que Madame
as
Bachelet,
well as Madam
Monsieur
Bachelet,
Griffith et
Mr.
Madame
Griffiths,
Luzan
and Madam
pour leur
Luzan
présentation.
for their briefings.
Permettez-moi de
I
saluer le
wish
travail
to
remarquable
applaud the
des
remarkable
agences
work
des Nations
of
Unies
United
et des
Nations
acteurs
agencies as well
humanitaires.
as humanitarian actors.
Nous venons de
We have
l'entendre,
just heard
votre visite, Monsieur le
that
Secrétaire
your visit,
général, à
Mr. Secretary
Kiev et à
General, to
Moscou
Kiev and
a
Moscow
permis l'évacuation de
facilitated
centaines
the
de civils.
resulted in the
Soyez-en
evacuation of
remerciés.
hundreds of civilians. We are grateful
Mais
for that.
combien sont
However,
encore
how
là-bas,
many more are still
terrés dans les
there,
tunnels de la Syrie
are still there
d'Azovstal,
in the
bloqués
tunnels of the
dans les recoins de
Azovstal
Mariupol,
steel plant,
pilonnés
blocked in the
par
corners
l'armée
of
russe?
Mariupol,
Il
battered
est
by the Russian
essentiel que
army? There is a
l'évacuation
vital
des civils
need
se
for the
poursuive
evacuation of
en toute
civilians to
sécurité
continue
et sur
in a
la base
safe
du
and secure
volontariat,
way,
en
on a
laissant le choix
voluntary
aux personnes
basis,
évacuées de leur
leaving
destination.
evacuees
La
with
France
the
condamne
choice
la
of
reprise de
destination.
l'offensive par la
We
Russie
condemn the resumption of
et
the
le maintien du siège de la ville
offensive by the Russian
au
Federation and
mépris
the
du droit
maintenance of the
international
siege of the city
humanitaire. Elle
in
condamne également
contempt for the
les frappes
humanitarian law. We also
indiscriminées qui ont
condemn
touché Kiev
indiscriminate
lors de votre
strikes
visite, Monsieur le Secrétaire général.
which struck
Celles-ci
Kiev during
traduisent
your
la
visit,
piètre
Mr.
estime dans
Secretary
laquelle
General.
la Russie
This
tient les
reflects
Nations
the low
Unies,
esteem
elle qui
in
ne
which,
cesse de
with
piétiner
which
la
the Russian
charte
Federation
et ses
holds the
principes
United Nations. The
fondateurs
Russian
depuis
Federation,
le
which
début
continues
de
to
cette guerre.
trample upon the Charter and its
Madame
core
la Présidente,
principles
depuis
since
plus
the
de
very
2
beginning of
mois,
this war.
l'armée russe
For more than
tue
2
des
months, the
civils,
Russian army has been
y
killing
compris des enfants,
civilians,
des
including
personnels
children,
humanitaires et des
humanitarian
journalistes.
personnel, and
Plus d'un
journalists.
quart
More
de
than
la
one
population
quarter of the
ukrainienne a
Ukrainian
été
population
forcée
was
de fuir
forced to
et ce
flee.
chiffre ne
And
cesse
this
d'augmenter.
figure
Les
continues
civils
to
ne trouvent
rise.
plus de répit,
Civilians have
ni
no
dans les écoles,
respite,
ni dans
neither
les
in
hôpitaux.
schools nor in
La Russie bombarde
hospitals.
de manière
Russia has
indiscriminée,
been
frappe les
indiscriminately
infrastructures d'accès à l'eau et
bombing
pose
the
des mines
area,
dans les champs dans
targeting
le but
water
de priver
infrastructure
la
and laying
population
down
ukrainienne
mines
des biens
in
nécessaires à sa
fields with the
survie.
aim of stripping the
La
Ukrainian
priorité
population
est
of
à la
the means
cessation
necessary for their
immédiate des
survival.
hostilités
There's a
et au plein
priority
respect du
in
droit
immediate
international
cessation of
humanitaire et des droits de l'homme.
hostilities and full respect
L'accès
for
doit
international
être de
humanitarian
toute
law.
urgence garanti
There is an urgent
à
need
Mariupol
for
et dans
humanitarian access
toutes
to be
les villes
provided to
assiégées,
Mariupol and
alors que
all all
plus de 15
besieged
millions de
cities
personnes
at a
ont
time
besoin
when
d'aide.
more than 15
La
million
France
people need
continuera à
assistance.
prendre toute sa
France will
part.
continue to
Elle a
fully
acheminé plus de
contribute to this.
815
We
tonnes
delivered
d'aide
more
en
than
réponse à la
815
crise
tons of
et plus de
assistance in
22 000
response to the
tonnes d'aide
crisis,
d'urgence
and
ont
more than
été livrées
22,000
par l'Union
tons
européenne.
of
Notre soutien
urgent
global va s'accroître
emergency
et
assistance were
atteindre
delivered by the
2
European
milliards de
Union. Our
dollars,
overall
comme l'a
support
annoncé
will
ce
continue
jour
to
le
increase
président
and reach
Macron
$2
lors de
and
la
will reach
conférence des donateurs
$2 billion,
organisée
as
par la
was
Pologne
organized
et par la Suède.
by our president
Au-delà de
during the
l'Ukraine,
donors conference
le monde
organized
entier
by
est
our
affecté
Polish
par
and
cette
Swedish
guerre
colleagues. Beyond
qui
Ukraine, the
risque de faire
entire
basculer
world
un
has been
cinquième de
afflicted
la
by this
population
war,
mondiale
which
dans
is
la
liable to
pauvreté et
plunge
l'insécurité
1/5 of the world's
alimentaire.
population into
La Russie doit
poverty,
lever le blocus des
destitution,
ports
and food
ukrainiens en mer
insecurity.
Noire
Russia must
afin de
lift the
permettre
blockade of the
l'exportation des
Ukrainian
denrées
ports
alimentaires.
in the Black Sea in order to
Madame la
facilitate
Présidente,
food
je le dis avec
exports.
fermeté, les
Madam
criminels de
President,
guerre
I
seront traduits en
state this
justice.
emphatically. War
La France
criminals
soutient à
will
cet
be
égard
held
le déploiement
accountable. In
rapide
this regard, France
de mécanismes de
supports the
reddition
prompt
de comptes.
deployment
Elle
of
continuera à
accountability
être résolument
mechanisms. We will
engagée aux côtés
continue
des
to be
Ukrainiens et des
resolutely engaged
juridictions et mécanismes
alongside the
internationaux,
Ukrainian
notamment
people
la Cour
and
pénale
international
internationale.
jurisdictions and mechanisms, including
Enfin, je
particularly the
tiens à
International Criminal Court.
répéter que
Lastly,
la
I wish
France
to
continuera de
reiterate
se
the
tenir
fact
résolument
that
aux
France
côtés
will
de
continue
l'Ukraine
to
et de son
stand
peuple,
firmly by the side of
auquel je souhaite
Ukraine
ici
and
rendre
its
hommage
people, and I wish to
pour
pay
son
tribute
courage
to
et sa
them for their
résistance acharnée.
courage and their
Je vous
staunch
remercie.
resistance. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to first of all thank Secretary General Guterres, Under Secretary General Griffith, High Commissioner Ashley, and Ms. Luzan for their briefings. I've also listened to the statement by Ms. Luzan. The fighting in Ukraine has been raging on for more than 2 months, and China has repeatedly expanded its position thereof. The longer the conflict lasts, the more people will suffer. The priority at hand is to step up efforts to promote ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. Secretary General Guterres visited Russia and Ukraine last week and met with the leaders of the two countries, calling for creating conditions for effective dialogue so as to achieve a ceasefire as soon as possible. The Secretary General has also made unremitting efforts to mitigate the humanitarian situation. It is heartening to note that after the visit of the Secretary General, and thanks to the intensified coordination between the UN and the RCRC, Russia and Ukraine have agreed to arrange for the evacuation of the civilians stranded in Mariupol, and more than 300 civilians have been successfully evacuated from Mariupol and other places to Zaporizhia. China welcomes this positive progress that was made possible through consultations amongst the relevant parties, and thanks to the Secretary General for his instrumental role. At present, the humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict remains dire, and the ever-increasing civilian casualties are deeply lamentable. Once again, we call on the parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint, avoid hurting innocent civilians and civilian facilities, and give priority to ensuring the humanitarian relief and assistance for such vulnerable groups as women and children. Building on the evacuation work in Mariupol, all parties concerned should establish a broader and more efficient humanitarian coordination mechanism so as to ensure the safe and smooth operation of the evacuation and humanitarian rescue channels and minimize the humanitarian impact resulting from the conflict. International humanitarian agencies should continue to mobilize the international community to increase resource inputs to help Ukraine and its neighboring countries to cope with the pressure of humanitarian relief, spare no effort to save lives, alleviate people's sufferings, and create conditions for the safe and orderly return of refugees to their homes. Madam President, the signs that point to a protracted and enlarged conflict are truly worrying. It has to be pointed that delivering weapons will not deliver peace, and the conflict has no winners. Dialogue and negotiation is the only and inevitable way to resolve disputes. Russia and Ukraine have built some groundwork in the previous negotiations. All the more reason for them to continue talks against all odds. The international community should create enabling conditions for the Russia-Ukraine negotiations and do more things to facilitate the political settlement rather than the other way around. It is not only morally despicable to try and benefit from the turmoil, but also dangerous in reality. Doing so is doomed to backfire. Continued fighting and all-dimensional and indiscriminate sanctions are subjecting people in all countries, not least developing countries, to higher food prices, oil prices, and other hefty prices. Arbitrary seizure and freezing of foreign exchange reserves of other countries is tantamount to weaponizing economic interdependence, which is bringing more uncertainties and perils to the world economy and international relations. We call on the international community to strengthen macroeconomic policy coordination and work together to effectively regulate and contain the negative spillover effects of the Ukrainian conflict. Madam President, the lessons emanating from the Ukrainian crisis are profound and deserving of serious reflections. Security of all countries is indivisible. To base one country's security on the insecurity of other countries is neither reasonable nor operable. NATO's repeated eastward expansion after the Cold War has not only failed to make Europe any safer, but also sowed the seeds of conflict. Contrary to its claim to be an organization defensive in nature, NATO wantonly launches wars against southern countries, causing colossal casualties and humanitarian disasters. The day after tomorrow is May the 7th. On May the 7th, 1999, NATO fired a number of precision-guided missiles at the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, killing 3 Chinese journalists and injuring more than 20 Chinese diplomats. The Chinese people will never forget this barbaric atrocity and will never allow such history to repeat itself. Now that the Cold War is behind us, NATO should naturally size up the situation and make necessary adjustments, clinging to the anachronistic doctrine of security and keen to provoke bloc confrontation and create tensions in Europe and even in the Asia-Pacific region and world at large. Such practices are as harmful to others as they are deleterious to the perpetrators themselves and deserve nothing less than China's firm opposition. The world does not need a new Cold War, and it cannot afford greater turmoil and division. China solemnly advocates that in order to solve the practical problems of human security and seek a long-term solution to world peace, all countries should reaffirm their commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, earnestly uphold the principle of indivisibility of security, forge synergy through consultations, and build together a balanced, effective, and sustainable global and regional security architecture. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Let me begin by congratulating you on your assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of May and to wish you the best of success during the month. I also take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the UK delegation for their able leadership of the Council last month. We thank the Secretary General for his statement and have paid close attention to the important briefings by the USG, Martin Griffiths, and Madam Mitchell Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and thank them also for their coordination of the United Nations efforts and actions in Ukraine. We also thank Ms. Tatiana Luzan for highlighting the work of her organization in the area of protection assistance. Madam President, it is the ordinary people of Ukraine who continue to bear the brunt of the war, with women, children, and the aged being disproportionately affected. Urgent action is therefore imperative to stem the rising humanitarian crisis and restore the hope of peace, which has so far eluded the people of Ukraine. We therefore welcome the important undertakings of the Secretary General during his recent visit to Moscow and Kyiv, where he held discussions with President Putin and President Zelensky, personally assessed the impact of the war, and helped to mobilize humanitarian evacuations in Mariupol. We encourage the continued deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General in the international endeavor to bring an end to the war and facilitate a diplomatic solution to the ongoing security and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We commend the facilitative role played by the United Nations and the International Red Cross in the coordinated evacuation of civilians from the Azovstal steel plant on 3rd May 2022. We however regret the resumption of heavy shelling and airstrikes aimed at the steel plant before all the people could be removed to safety. Intense efforts must be made to secure the immediate evacuation of close to 1,000 people, including an estimated number of 30 children still holed up in the underground tunnels of the steel plant with little access to food, water, and medical assistance. We urge the parties to agree to further humanitarian pauses and demilitarized humanitarian corridors in all besieged areas to help protect the lives of civilians and ensure unobstructed delivery of humanitarian aid to alleviate suffering. We note the set obligation of the parties to conduct themselves in accordance with the rules of international law and international humanitarian law, and reiterate our call on them to implement necessary measures to protect civilians and humanitarian workers from harm, while also avoiding the deliberate destruction of civilian and critical infrastructure, including in Lviv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and the Donbas region, where intense fighting continues to rage. We continue also to be concerned by the growing reports of gross human rights violations and possible war crimes involving summary killings, forced disappearances, human trafficking, and conflict-related sexual violence, and reiterate the necessity of an independent, impartial, and thorough investigations to ensure effective accountability and secure justice for the innocent victims of the war. We welcome in this regard the investigations opened into all cases of alleged atrocities. Madam President, beyond the destruction and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, the impact of the war is already being felt on the food, energy, and financial systems of the world. The disruptions in food supply chains and the high cost of energy have caused historical rises in cost of living globally. The stifling economic effects, along with the existing difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic, have the potential to fester socio-political tensions and instability, especially in developing economies that have little fiscal space to contain the shocks. Ending the war in Ukraine now is therefore not only urgent to avoid a direct humanitarian crisis for the Ukrainian people, but also critical to abate a global meltdown which would linger and have deep adverse impacts on the global economy, the security architecture, and the multilateral order. Furthermore, we are concerned that avowed commitments of the parties to engage in negotiations has so far not yielded the desired results due to growing mistrust and widening differences in expectations. We encourage the parties to recommit to the objectives of peace and the settlement of their disputes. The international community and the Security Council in particular must, in this context, overcome inherent challenges to facilitate a constructive dialogue. First, to support the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, and second, to provide a forum within which the core geopolitical and security concerns of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and NATO and its allied countries can be sustainably addressed. In closing, Madam President, we call on the members of this Council to find common purpose in working to restore and maintain the peace and security of Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. Congratulations on your assumption of the presidency this month. I thank the Secretary General for his remarks and welcome him back to New York after his extensive and important travels. I also thank the other briefers for their presentations and the work that they're doing every day, and welcome the participation of Ukraine's distinguished permanent representative, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, among other speakers today. Madam President, the briefings we have heard make it clear that the war in Ukraine, caused by the armed breach of the country's territorial integrity by the Russian Federation, is causing extreme suffering. It is also sadly clear that sufficient care is not being accorded by combatants to the protection of civilians. After all, the millions of civilians who have fled their homes only did so because they understood that their lives and properties would be directly harmed in the course of the conflict. We are gravely concerned by the latest developments in Mariupol, Izium, and Popasna, among other cities. The reports from these cities reveal heavy artillery shelling and airstrikes that are destroying civilian objects at scale. These acts constitute a violation of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law. Kenya condemns the disproportionate use of force, the use of human shields, and the exploitation of civilian suffering as a tactic of war. As important as it is for the Security Council to be clear in its condemnation of those violating our shared values and rules, it is more urgent to stop the present cycle of escalation. Public statements by the combatants and their allies suggest that there is little respite from violence that civilians in Ukraine can look forward to. Instead, weapons and soldiers are being deployed in ever greater numbers. The war itself and its aims are being communicated as existential. There are even repeated mentions of the possible use of nuclear weapons being made in the media. The increased battlefield engagements, combined with their propaganda counterpart in the shaping of domestic and international public opinion, plus the apocalyptic tone, may lead to a far more dangerous escalation than is presently the case, with the result being even more Ukrainians being harmed. Connected to the harm being done to the civilians in Ukraine is the harm that the war is causing in other parts of the world. The inability of Ukraine to export its harvests and fertilizers is directly contributing to the immiseration of many millions, and serious harm is being caused to their food security. This is particularly the case in relatively poor and food insecure countries in the global south, including those in Africa. The unprecedented sanctions in response to the war are also reshaping global development, food security, and even political stability. With every new mention of nuclear weapons as part of the conflict continuum, or promises of unceasing war until one side is permanently disabled, global equity and debt markets will exit riskier emerging market economies, and investors will delay or cancel the investments that we all need to deliver sufficient jobs to our young people. Madam President, it is therefore our contention that the civilians in Ukraine, while under the more immediate threat of extreme violence, are united in their interest for safety with the billions of other civilians globally. It means that the whole world has a stake in an immediate cessation of hostilities for humanitarian purposes, followed by a structured ceasefire that enables meaningful negotiations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. In addition, if we want the global markets to play a part in the development of the global south, rather than the reverse, then Europe's security order must be placed on a stable footing. Added to the growing global economic crisis, that stable security order in Europe is also needed if we are to limit the harm to civilians from climate change. The present arraying of major geopolitical forces in a growing conflict will make it next to impossible to undertake ambitious climate change action. Even before this war started, agreement on climate adaptation and mitigation action was plagued by lack of trust, changing goalposts, and unmet commitments. If climate change is indeed, as the science informs us, leading to serious harms to humanity, then we can count this war and its deleterious impact on multilateralism as yet another worldwide blow to the safety and security of civilians worldwide. Madam President, the multilateral system at this rate may not survive the multiple major crises we are causing while undermining its ability to solve them. As a minimum response to protecting the peace, Kenya urges member states to place more trust in the good offices of the Secretary General. The historical record of the use of these good offices is replete with shortcomings, but also with great successes. The decisive factor has been the extent to which conflicting states and their most influential allies give the Secretary General space to help mediate conflict at all stages. We therefore welcome the Secretary General's recent trips to Russia and Ukraine, where he sought commitments for a ceasefire, safe humanitarian passage, and to encourage negotiations. We urge the parties to embrace his readiness to mediate. Their doing so will signal their regard and respect for our United Nations. Madam President, I underscore in conclusion that the continued undermining and even destruction of multilateralism will only lead to more war. It will be a catastrophe for civilians in multiple regions and countries. Stopping the war in Ukraine offers us all an opportunity to live up to the Charter's promise to protect succeeding generations from our own shortcomings. I reaffirm Kenya's respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank the participation of Secretary General António Guterres, High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, USG Martin Griffiths, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan, as well as their first-hand accounts from the conflict in Ukraine. The Brazilian government continues to follow closely the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Our utmost priorities should be the immediate cessation of hostilities and the strengthening of diplomatic negotiations in order to bring a lasting solution to this crisis, one that does not only end the conflict, but also contributes to improve the security and defense architecture in Europe. Further than the human rights violations and the humanitarian costs of the conflict, we are also attentive to the negative economic effects of the war for the whole world, especially in the form of higher food and energy prices, which have particularly dire consequences for developing countries. We acknowledge the efforts of the Secretary General in his recent visits to Moscow and Kyiv to discuss with Presidents Putin and Zelensky how to establish safe humanitarian corridors to allow the evacuation of civilians from conflagrated areas, such as in the city of Mariupol. We commend all the tireless work being done by the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross to provide humanitarian aid to millions of people inside Ukraine, being cognizant that the needs of humanitarian assistance remain huge. We would also like to express our appreciation to the neighboring countries of Ukraine for keeping their borders open to refugees. I would also like to express my recognition to the Secretary General for having raised this afternoon, despite not being the central focus of this meeting, the impact that the conflict and its associated factors are having on food security worldwide. Brazil stresses the importance of all parties in the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, especially in its provisions regarding the protection of civilians. Of particular concern to Brazil are, first, the consequences of shelling of urban areas, including with the use of explosive weapons and the targeting of civilians. Second, the need to avoid the destruction of civilian infrastructure and the disruption of basic services. Third, the protection of the elderly, people with disabilities, and children, among other vulnerable groups. Fourth, the protection of humanitarian personnel and unimpeded humanitarian access. And fifth, the protection of refugees and internally displaced persons. It is our belief that the humanitarian resolution adopted by the General Assembly last March provides an adequate framework for concrete actions on the ground, as guaranteeing safe passage for civilians and unimpeded access for humanitarian personnel. Furthermore, Resolution A/Res/ES11/2 provides us with the main objectives we should strive to achieve, in particular, the full compliance by all parties to the armed conflict, to respect international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. Within its capabilities, Brazil is contributing to the humanitarian efforts, offering shelter to citizens fleeing the armed conflict in Ukraine. Since last March, Brazil has granted temporary visas and residency authorization for Ukrainian nationals and stateless persons who have been affected or displaced by the events in Ukraine. Brazil has also donated food, medicine, and water purifiers to the victims of the conflict. Madam President, the lives and well-being of civilians in conflagrated areas are in great jeopardy. The cessation of hostilities is a matter of urgency. We have already witnessed too much suffering. The effective delivery of humanitarian aid is of paramount importance. Moreover, we need a resumption of diplomatic negotiations that are conducive to a peaceful and lasting solution to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I'd like to welcome back the Secretary-General and thank him for his briefing this afternoon, and also to extend a particularly warm welcome to Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner Bachelet, and also thanks to Under-Secretary-General Griffiths, and a big thank you to Tatiana Luzan for updating us today, both of you, on the humanitarian disaster in Ukraine. Excuse me. Your briefings highlight yet again the utter senselessness of this unlawful war. Madam President, 11 weeks into this unjustifiable war, we continue to witness widespread destruction, indiscriminate attacks, and unconscionable human suffering. As each day passes, reports of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russia grow. And, as we've heard from colleagues around this table, the consequences are being felt far beyond Ukraine and Europe. Russia must end its war now. We salute the courageous decision by the Secretary-General to visit Moscow and Kyiv last week. The founders of these United Nations were clear on their primary objective: to prevent the human suffering wrought from war. The Secretary-General speaks for all of us in deploring this war and calling for its end. The cynical timing of further attacks on civilian infrastructure during your time in Kyiv, Secretary-General, and following your visit to Moscow, is further evidence of the disdain that has been shown towards the UN. It is more than regrettable that we should have to recall that the Secretary-General of the UN is appointed by all members of the UN. He is mandated by all members of the UN. We have a responsibility towards our Secretary-General. Secretary-General, what you witnessed in Bucha, in Irpin, in Borodyanka, follows the devastation wrought on Kharkiv, Kherson, and Mariupol, as well as elsewhere. Civilians, as you said, are paying the highest price for this conflict. We commend the work of the UN agencies in Ukraine and the organizations with whom they are working to alleviate the suffering there. They have our support, they have our appreciation. We welcome your work to put in place arrangements for the evacuation of civilians from Mariupol. We welcome the ongoing life-saving work of the UN and the ICRC there. We believe that thousands still remain trapped and under siege. We encourage all parties to ensure that these safe passage operations continue and that humanitarian aid reach all those in need. Parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to limit attacks to military objects. That also includes the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Compliance is not optional. Madam President, we have heard today from High Commissioner Bachelet of how civilians continue to bear the brunt of this unconscionable war. We condemn the horrific violations documented by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Unlawful killings, including summary executions, conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detentions and deportations, including of journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists, enforced disappearances, and torture of prisoners of war. All allegations of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law must continue to be investigated and those responsible held to account. The people of Ukraine deserve nothing less. Let's be clear, Madam President. Daily, we see the devastating impact of the use of explosive weapons, including prohibited cluster munitions, by Russian forces in populated areas without regard for civilians. We see the toll of destruction of homes, hospitals, and schools. We know what we're dealing with. It cannot be dismissed as fake news. The sheer scale of destruction in itself belies the Russian Federation's attempt to dissemble and distort reality. We condemn indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks in all circumstances. We reject all efforts to question reality. We are resolved to ensuring accountability for the atrocious crimes taking place in Ukraine. We recognize the important role of the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court in helping to pursue this. We must not, we cannot accept impunity for those inflicting such horrors, not in Ukraine, not anywhere else in the world. As you said last week, High Commissioner, accountability is a cornerstone of upholding human rights. We will never shirk our responsibility in upholding human rights. We once again call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law, to allow full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian personnel, to allow all those seeking to leave Ukraine to do so safely and to destinations of their choosing. Civilians who choose to remain in Ukraine are not combatants. That is a fact, pure and simple. They must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the international community and this Council must not become numb to the devastation and tragedy that continues in Ukraine. I am marked by the horror of the death of a 91-year-old Holocaust survivor who froze to death in a basement in Mariupol, her life ending under our watch, in a shameful reflection of how as a child she had hidden to save her own life during the war she called the Great Patriotic War. Stopping this war today could not undo what has been done. It could not bring back those lost, nor erase the horrors that those who have been forced to flee have endured. It could not undo the human suffering already caused around the world. But it would stop the slaughter. It would save lives. Russia must end its aggression, comply with its obligations under international law, and withdraw all forces unconditionally from the entirety of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. We call again on the Russian Federation to end its war. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
во-первых, хотели бы
first and
поздравить
foremost, we wish
Соединенные
to
Штаты
congratulate the United
с
States
вступлением в должность
on
председателя Совета
the
Безопасности в
accession to the
мае.
presidency of the Security Council for the month of May.
Рассчитываем,
We trust
что в отличие от
that,
предшествующего,
unlike the
ваше
previous
председательство
presidency,
будет
yours
эффективным
will
и
be
беспристрастным,
effective and
как это должно
impartial
быть
and
свойственно
objective,
председателю Совета
as is
Безопасности,
necessary
когда он
for
исполняет
presidency
эту должность, а не выступает в национальном качестве.
when the presidency is held represented by not in a national capacity.
Когда он исполняет свою должность,
When
когда он
the
исполняет свою
president
должность,
carries out their
свои
duties,
обязанности, а не
their
выступает в национальном
obligations,
качестве.
and does not act in their national capacity.
Вынуждены сказать
It
для
behooves
протокола
me to
несколько
note
слов
for
об участии в
the
сегодняшнем
record
заседании
a
в
number
качестве
of
брифера
remarks for the
Верховного
briefers,
комиссара по
the
правам
High
человека
Commissioner for
Мишель
Human
Бачелет.
Rights, Madam Bachelet.
Не касаясь сути сказанного,
I will not delve into the essence of what she
ее
has
односторонних
stated,
оценок,
nor
чему у
her
нас
unilateral one-sided
возникло немало
assessments.
вопросов.
We have a number of questions that arose
Хотел
in
бы
connection to that. However,
напомнить и
I wish to
коллегам, и
recall
самому
for
Верховному
both
комиссару,
colleagues and the High Commissioner
согласно резолюции
herself that according to
Генассамблеи
General Assembly Resolution
учредившей мандат
48-101,
Верховного
which
комиссара,
established 141, which
данное
established the mandate of the High
должностное лицо
Commissioner.
несет под
This
руководством
official
и эгидой
is
Генерального
under the
секретаря
aegis of the Secretary
основную
General
ответственность за
and
деятельность
thereby
СВО в
bears
области
the main
прав
responsibility
человека
for United
в
Nations
рамках
human rights
общей
action within the
компетенции,
framework of the
полномочий
overall
и
authority
решений
and
Генассамблеи
decision of the General
ЭКОСОС
Assembly,
и Совета по
ECOSOC,
правам
and
человека.
the Human Rights Council.
Ни на какие другие вопросы,
No
относящиеся
other
к тематике
issues
поддержания
related to
международного
the
мира и
question of the maintenance of
безопасности
international peace
или
and
защиты
security
гражданских
or
лиц,
protection of civilians
его компетенция не
fall
распространяется.
under their purview.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
вот уже 2
for
месяца
2
мы
months
обсуждаем
now, we have been
события на
discussing
Украине,
the developments in
и 2
Ukraine.
месяца,
And for 2 months,
помимо потока
beyond
враждебности,
the flow of
лжи,
hostility,
фейков,
lies,
ненависти
deceit,
и
fakes,
оскорблений,
hatred, and insults,
мы слышим один
we
и тот
have
же вопрос.
heard the same old question.
Как могла Россия,
How could Russia
неспровоцированно,
have,
как они
unprovoked,
говорят,
as they say,
напасть на
attacked a
суверенную,
sovereign,
демократическую,
democratic,
неагрессивную,
non-aggressive,
независимую,
independent,
мирную Украину?
peaceful Ukraine?
Ведь она не представляла никакой
For
угрозы для самой
it
России.
did not pose any threat to Russia itself.
Среди тех, кто это
Among
говорит или
those
кто
who
так
say
думает,
this or who
допускаю,
think
есть люди
this,
искренние,
I allow that there may
не
be
понимавшие,
those who
что
are
на самом
sincere,
деле
those who may not
происходило все эти
understand
годы.
what actually took place for all
А
of these
есть люди и
years.
страны,
There are also
лукавые,
people and
давно
countries who are
мечтавшие превратить
sly,
Украину
who
в
have
плацдарм
long
для битвы с
dreamed of
Россией.
transforming Ukraine into a bridgehead for a battle against Russia.
И они
And
делали
they
все для
have
этого с
done
момента обретения
everything
Украины
possible to achieve this
независимости
since
30 лет
Ukraine
назад.
gained independence 30 years ago.
Политически,
Politically,
идеологически,
ideologically,
а сегодня
and
продолжают
today they
делать это,
continue to do
накачивая
this
Украину
by
вооружением.
flooding weapons into Ukraine.
То, что
What
происходило на самой
happened
Украине
in
все
Ukraine
эти годы,
itself for all of
не
these
уместится в
years
формат
will not
сегодняшнего
fit
выступления.
into the format of today's
Да и вряд ли
statement.
многие из вас
And it is
захотят
unlikely
это
that most of
услышать и
you will even
понять.
want to hear this or understand it.
Как вы и раньше не
As you
понимали и не хотели
previously did
понять
not
этого.
understand and did not wish to understand
Мы
this.
неоднократно
We have
говорили здесь, в
repeatedly
этом
stated
зале, про
here in
трудности
this
перевода.
hall, we've talked about things being lost in translation.
Вы слушаете
You
украинскую
hear
власть в
and you listen
переводе.
to the Ukrainian
А
authorities
они
in
говорили
the
и говорят вам то,
translation,
что вы сами
and they have told you, and they
хотите услышать.
continue to tell you what you want to hear.
А мы слушали и
We
слушаем
have
киевскую
listened to
власть.
them, and we continue to
Без
listen to
перевода.
them in the
И знали и
original,
знаем
without translation. We
об
have
их
known, and we
лукавстве,
continue to know about their machinations,
их
their
недоговороспособности,
intractability,
их лжи,
their
их
lies,
обмане,
their
в
deceit,
том числе собственного народа на
including
протяжении всех
before
этих
their
лет.
own people over the course of all of these years.
Вместо обустройства
Instead
собственного
of providing
государства
for their
процветал
own
режим
state, there was
олигархии и
an
тотальной коррупции,
oligarchical, completely corrupt
от
regime
чего
which
морщились
flourished,
даже западные
and even
покровители Киева.
Western sponsors of Kiev winced at this.
Знаем, как они пытались
We are
создать
aware how
собственную
they
идеологию,
attempted to create their own
основанную на отрицании
ideology
всего русского и
based
того,
on
что
a
нас связывало
repudiation
на
of
протяжении
everything Russian
столетий.
and everything and all that has linked us
Вы не
for
знаете и не хотите
centuries. You
знать,
do not know and you do not wish
каким
to know
оскорблениям и
about
ненависти
what
подвергалось все
insults
связанное с
and
Россией.
hatred was targeted against everything
Причем не
related to
только на
Russia,
бытовом уровне,
not just at the
но и на
everyday
уровне
level, but also
государственных и
at the
общественных
level
деятелей.
of government officials and public figures.
Вы не знаете, что за
You do
годы
not know
независимости
that since
на основе
independence,
бредовых украинских учебников
absurd
истории
Ukrainian school history books
выросло целое
have
поколение людей,
spawned an
воспитанных на
entire
ненависти к
generation of
России.
people who have been reared with the hatred of Russia.
Русофобия стала
Russophobia
главным
has
внутренним
become the main
национальным продуктом
domestic
украинской
national
власти
product for the Ukrainian
и главным
authorities
экспортным
and
товаром Украины.
Ukraine's main export.
Вы не
You will
найдете в
not
российском
find
обществе
in Russian
ничего
society
подобного по отношению к Украине
anything
и к
of the
украинцам.
sort with respect to Ukraine or Ukrainian people.
Вы просто не
You
слышите их
simply don't
лозунги.
hear their
Вы не
slogans.
замечаете их
You
факельных
simply don't
шествий.
notice their
Вы не
torch-bearing
видите их
marches. You do not
националистов
see
и
their
откровенных нацистов.
nationalists and their undisguised Nazis.
Один умный
One
человек,
intelligent
украинец,
person, a Ukrainian,
историк Олесь Бузина,
Олесь Бузина,
которого
historian,
националисты убили
who
в
was
2015
killed
году.
in 2015 by the
А он был
nationalists,
патриотом
and he was
Украины.
a patriot of Ukraine.
Преступление,
This was a
разумеется,
crime,
до сих пор
which
не
of course has
расследовано, при
not
том,
yet
что
been
убийцы
investigated, despite the
были
fact that
известны.
the murders were well known.
Так вот, он
So
справедливо сказал,
Buzina quite rightly
что с
said
распадом
that with
империи
the
на
collapse of
отделившихся окраинах
imperias
начинает
in
процветать
on the
крайний
border
махровый
line areas,
национализм,
there
замешанный
is
на глубоком
extreme
провинциализме.
blatant nationalism which thrives
Украина
and
самый
is
яркий
tinged
тому пример.
with the deepest provincialism. And Ukraine
Сегодня
is the starkest
это не
example
война
of
на
this today.
Украине,
This is
как вы
not a
говорите.
war in Ukraine,
Это
contrary to what you may
прокси-война
say,
коллективного
contrary to what
Запада
you
с
say.
Россией.
This is a proxy war of the collective West
Вы
against the
как
Russian
будто только и
Federation.
ждали
It is
этого
as if you
момента,
were
чтобы
eagerly
запустить
awaiting this
маховик
moment
репрессий против
to
России.
unleash repression against Russia.
И если говорить о
And if
мировой
we are to
войне,
talk about
то она
world war,
несомненно
then without a
ведется сегодня
doubt
в
it is
экономической
being
области.
waged at the economic level
У
today.
нас нет
We
сомнений,
have
что вы
no
к ней
doubt
готовились,
that you were preparing
потому
for
что
this
скорость, с
because the
которой был
speed with
запущен
which
этот
this
маховик,
was unleashed
не позволяет усомниться в
leaves
том,
us with
что вы
no
готовились к этому
doubt that you were
заранее и
preparing for
задолго до
this for a
того.
long time, well before all
Вы
of this
просто элементарно
transpired. You
грабите в
simply
лучших
are
традициях
basically
Дикого Запада.
morating in the finest traditions of
Если
the
кто-то здесь не
Wild
в
West.
курсе,
If anybody here
проинформирую,
is unaware, I
что
will
помимо
inform you
бесчисленных
that
санкций и
beyond
запретов,
the countless sanctions and
отъема
bans,
частной собственности
the
у российских
seizure of private
граждан,
property from
которые
Russian
никакого
citizens
отношения к
who have
специальной военной
nothing to
операции
do
не
with the
имеют.
special military operation,
Западными странами
Western
были заморожены
countries
принадлежащие России
froze
счета на сумму 300
accounts belonging
миллиардов
to
долларов.
Russia amounting to $300 billion.
О каком международном
What kind
праве
of
вы тогда
international
говорите?
law are you talking about
Это
then?
даже
This is not
невыдуманный
even
вами порядок,
the
основанный на праве.
rules-based order which you conceived of.
Это даже не
This is
колониализм,
not even
когда просвещенный
colonialism
Запад шел
when the
насаждать
enlightened
цивилизацию в своих
West
колониях,
marched to
попутно
impose
грабя их
civilization on
природные
its
ресурсы.
on its colonies, looting their national resources along the way.
Это не что иное, как элементарный
Natural
беспредел и
resources. This is
грабеж.
nothing other than the most basic lawlessness and plunder.
Так что сегодня
So
просто
today,
сброшены маски.
the masks have been cast off
Зато
quite simply.
сегодня стало
And
модным
today,
обвинять
however, it has
Россию
now
в
become trendy
энергетическом и
to accuse
продовольственном
Russia
кризисе,
of for
который
the
вы уже
energy
сами
and the
создали.
food crisis which you yourselves have created.
На протяжении 8 лет
8
мы говорили
years,
вам о
we
страданиях людей на Донбассе,
described to you the suffering of the people in
об
Donbass. We
обстрелах со
described
стороны
the shelling
вооруженных
by
сил
the
Украины и
Ukrainian armed forces
националистических
and the
батальонов,
nationalist battalions.
о гибели
We
от этих
told you about
обстрелов
the
мирных
deaths
жителей,
of civilians as a result
о
of
том,
these
что это не Донбасс
strikes.
пошел на
We
Киев,
described that this was
а
not
Киев пришел на
Donbass which
Донбасс.
attacked Kiev, but
Только
Kiev
потому,
which
что люди
attacked
там не
Donbass,
смирились с
only because
госпереворотом
people there did
и
not
политикой
accept the
тотальной
coup, nor did they
украинизации
accept the
майданных
policy
властей.
of complete Ukrainization
Вы
of the
не
Maidan
реагировали.
authorities. You did not respond.
Вы не хотите
You do
помнить
not
того,
wish
что
to recall
подобные
the fact
протесты в
that such
2014 году
protests
были жестоко
in
подавлены в Харькове,
2014
Одессе,
were
в
brutally
том же
dispersed in
Мариуполе.
Kharkov, Odessa, and that very same Mariupol.
Мы все эти 8
For
лет
all of
говорили
these
вам о
8
том,
years,
что это
we
надо
told
прекратить.
you that this had to be put to an
Для
end.
этого нужно было совсем немного.
Very little was needed to
Украинским
achieve
властям
that. The
выполнить
Ukrainian
Минские
authorities
соглашения,
simply had to
от которых
implement
они
the Minsk
публично
agreements,
отказались,
which they publicly
пользуясь вашим
repudiated,
покрывательством
using
и поддержкой,
your patronage and support,
и пребывая в иллюзии
and
полной
remaining
безнаказанности.
under the illusion that they would enjoy complete impunity.
Им нравилось
They
чувствовать себя
enjoyed
частью так
feeling
называемого
themselves to
цивилизованного
be a
мира и
part of
быть
the
вашими
so-called
вассалами.
civilized world. They enjoyed being your vassals.
Интересно, в свете нынешней
Interesting. In the light
ситуации
of the
кусает
current
ли по этому поводу
circumstances,
обанкротившейся украинской власти
Is the
велось сегодня.
are the bankrupt Ukrainian authorities deeply regretful of what is now
И
taking
теперь,
place?
когда после всего
And now,
этого,
after
после
all
всех
of that,
преступлений
after
киевского
all of
режима
the
и
crimes perpetrated by the
предупреждений,
Kiev regime
началась
and all of the
специальная военная
warnings, a
операция по
special
освобождению
military operation
Донбасса.
began to liberate Donbass.
Мы вдруг услышали
Now we
отчаянные
suddenly
вопли.
heard desperate pleas.
А нас за что?
What have we done wrong?
Тот, кто знает
Those
украино-российский
who
фольклор, поймет, о
are
чем я говорю.
knowledgeable in Ukrainian Russian folklore will understand what I'm talking about.
Но я и сам отвечу на этот
And I will
вопрос.
respond
Это
to
все
this
благодаря
question
вашим
myself. This is
западным
all thanks to
спонсорам и
your
покровителям,
Western
радостно потиравшим
sponsorship
руки при
and
виде того, как
patronage.
Украина
You
превращается в
eagerly
антироссию.
rubbed your hands together as you witnessed
Все,
Ukraine's
что
transformation
происходит
into an
сейчас,
anti-Russia.
началось не в
Everything that
конце
is
февраля.
transpiring now
И
began not
даже
in
не
late
8
February
лет назад.
and not even 8 years ago.
Это началось
This
гораздо
began
раньше, с
long
поощрения и
ago
поддержки
with the
Соединенных Штатов и их
support and
западных сателлитов.
encouragement of the United States and their Western satellites.
Мы неоднократно
We've
говорили о
repeatedly
наших
talked
озабоченностях
about our
в сфере
concerns, our
безопасности.
security concerns.
Вы на Западе
You in the
отмахивались от
West
этого,
brushed
не
them
воспринимали это
aside.
всерьез.
You did not take them
Уверяли
seriously.
самих
You
себя в
assured
сугубо оборонительном
yourselves
характере НАТО.
of the purely defensive nature of
При этом
NATO,
придвинув
at the
границы
same
блока вплотную к
time
нашим
moving
границам.
the borders of the
А сегодня
alliance
вы
right up
говорите
against
о
our borders.
глобальной
And
роли
today you are
Альянса,
talking
в
about
том
the
числе в
global
Азии.
role of the alliance, including in Asia.
Мы выдвинули
We
наши
advanced our
предложения по глобальной
proposals for
неделимой
global and
архитектуре
indivisible
безопасности.
security architecture.
Вы их высокомерно
You
отвергли.
arrogantly
И
cast
не
them
надо нас
aside,
убеждать
and there's no
сегодня в
need to
том, что
persuade
в
us
ваших планах
today about
никогда не было
to try to
стремления
persuade us that
затянуть
your
Украину в
plans
НАТО.
never included an attempt,
Были.
the desire to bring
Не
Ukraine into
сегодня, так
NATO. That
завтра.
was the case. If
Иллюзий
not
на
today,
этот
then tomorrow.
счет у нас не было и нет.
We had no illusions, and we have no illusions
Еще
about
раз
that.
хотим подчеркнуть.
Once again, we wish to
Украина как
reiterate and
таковая Западу не
underscore
нужна.
the West has no
Она
need for
была
Ukraine
нужна
as
и нужна
such.
только как
The
арена
Ukraine was necessary
противостояния с
to the
Россией.
West only as an arena for
У Украины
confrontation with
иллюзий
Russia.
также быть не
And
должно.
Ukraine should also be under no illusion.
Запад Украине не
The
поможет.
West will not help
Разве только
Ukraine
накачка
only
вооружений и
by
попыткой
providing
затянуть конфликт.
weapons and in an attempt to
И Запад уже
drag
воюет
out
с
the conflict.
Россией
And the
методом
West is
прокси-войны.
already waging a proxy war against
Сегодня
Russia.
не устаешь еще
Today,
больше удивляться
we
лицемерию наших
continue
западных
to be
партнеров.
shocked. Continuously are
Тема
shocked by the
агрессии
hypocrisy
США
of Western
и Запада в Ираке,
partners. The
Ливии,
theme, the question,
Сирии,
the issue of aggression of the
Югославии,
U.S. and the West in Iraq,
бесславная
Libya, Syria,
кампания в
Yugoslavia,
Афганистане.
the ignoble campaign
Не говоря
in
уже о том, что
Afghanistan,
было
not to
раньше,
mention
например, во
what
Вьетнаме.
preceded, for example, in
Как бы
Vietnam,
сошла на нет.
as if subsided into
Об этих трагедиях
insignificance.
сегодня
These
как бы не принято
tragedies,
вспоминать.
it is as if it is
Их
improper
как бы не
to
было.
recall these tragedies. Is it
Это
as
ведь дела
if they
давно
never
минувших
took
дней.
place? This is ancient history.
И Запад как бы
And the
здесь ни при
West
чем.
here is as if
Но еще бы,
beside the
ведь там
point.
шла борьба за
Of course,
демократию.
for there was a struggle there for
Правда,
democracy, a
стоившая
struggle for
жизни
democracy.
миллионов людей,
And yes, it
разрушение
came at the
городов и
cost
стран.
of millions
И
of
это за
people,
тысячи
the
километров
destruction
от
of
собственного дома.
cities and countries, and this was thousands of kilometers from
Зато
your own
сегодня мы
home.
слышим
And today we
бредовые
hear
рассуждения о
delirious
спонсорах
rhetoric
терроризма.
about sponsors of terrorism.
Позволю себе задать
I
риторический
will,
вопрос.
if I
Откуда
may,
появилась
pose
ИГИЛ?
a rhetorical question. Where did ISIL come from?
ИГИЛ появилась в
ISIL
результате вторжения США
was
в Ирак,
spawned as
а
a
его
result of the
основной
U.S.
костяк
invasion
составили
into
бывшие
Iraq, and its
военнослужащие
bedrock
иракской армии.
is comprised of former
Так кто
Iraqi
является
army
настоящим
personnel.
спонсором
So
терроризма?
who's the real sponsor of terrorism?
Сегодня мы живем в
Today,
состоянии
we are living in a
информационной,
state
а
of
точнее
information,
дезинформационной
or
войны.
more accurately,
Ее
disinformation
объектом
war.
является
Its
Россия.
target is Russia.
Мы уже не раз
We
говорили,
have
какие
repeatedly
колоссальные силы специальных психологических
pointed to the
операций
colossal forces,
брошены на
special psychological
информационное
operations,
поле
which
боя.
have been deployed on the information
Задача не только
battlefield.
очернить
The objective is
противника,
not only
но и
to
обезоружить
tarnish
его,
the
лишив
adversary,
доступа
but to
его средств
disarm it,
массовой
to
информации
strip it of access
к
to
мировой
information, to
общественности
strip
и
access for
попутно
information
обвинить в пропаганде.
outlets to the international community,
Мировая
and to
общественность
accuse them
должна
of
слышать
propaganda
только одну
along the way.
версию
The
событий.
international community needs to hear only one version
О
of
так
the
называемых
events.
зверствах
The
российских
so-called
военнослужащих,
atrocities of
о
the Russian
преднамеренном
soldiers,
обстреле
the
жилых домов и
deliberate
убийстве
shelling of
гражданского населения.
residential homes,
И
and the
уж
murder of
совсем
civilians,
бредовую
and the
идею
completely delirious idea,
о геноциде
the
украинского
genocide
народа.
of the Ukrainian people.
Запад вел
The
многолетнюю
West has
артподготовку на
waged a
информационном поле.
long-standing artillery barrage on
Но
the
если
information
раньше
field,
информационная
whereas
война
previously the
сопровождала
information
войну
war was
реальную, то
accompanied the
сейчас
real
стало
war,
все ровно наоборот.
now this has been reversed.
Зато мировая
And
общественность
yet
не
the
должна ничего
international
слышать об
community
украинских
doesn't need to hear
провокациях,
anything about Ukrainian
как, например, в Буче или
provocation. For example, in
Краматорске,
Bucha, in
о том, как
Kramatorsk,
украинские националисты
about the way
прикрываются
Ukrainian
гражданским
nationalists
населением,
use civilians as
размещая
cover,
огневые точки у больниц, школ
placing
и
gun
детских садов.
emplacements at homes and kindergartens and hospitals,
около жилых домов и
near
квартир граждан.
homes and the flats, civilian
Как они сгоняют их в подвалы,
residences, the
не
way they
выпускают оттуда,
push
не
them into
разрешая
basements,
выходить
they
по
do not
гуманитарным
let them
коридорам,
out, and they do not let them
которые
use
ежедневно
humanitarian
предоставляют
corridors,
российские
which
военные.
Russian soldiers provide
А
every
если
day.
кто-то выходит, по
And
ним
if
часто
somebody is
стреляют в
able to
спину своих.
evacuate, they are often shot in the back by by
Тому
those
есть масса
same
свидетельств
persons.
самих
There are
украинцев.
troves of evidence about this
Только
from the
вы не
Ukrainians
хотите это
themselves.
слышать.
You just don't want to hear it.
Вы когда-нибудь видели
Have you ever
свидетельства
seen
российских военнопленных
evidence
военнопленных
from
и кадры
Russian
их пыток
prisoners of
украинскими
war, images
националистами,
of their being
которые они
tortured by
выкладывают в
Ukrainian
соцсети?
nationalists, which they then post
Вы
on
когда-нибудь
social
видели
networks?
нечто
Have
подобное
you
со
ever
стороны
seen
российских
anything
военнослужащих
similar
по
by
отношению к украинским
Ukrainian
военнопленным?
soldiers against Ukrainian prisoners of war?
Вы видели
Have
репортажи
you seen
иностранных
the reports
корреспондентов,
from foreign
которых российские
correspondents
военные привозят
who Russian
в освобожденные
soldiers
украинские
bring
города
in to
и дают
liberated
им
Ukrainian
возможность все осматривать и
cities,
говорить
and
с
they
кем
provide them
угодно?
with an opportunity to look
Вы
around and to
когда-нибудь
speak with
слышали,
anybody?
что
Have you
говорят
ever
люди из этих
heard
городов?
what people from those cities
Как
say
действовали и вели себя по отношению к
about
ним украинские
the
националисты?
Ukrainian nationalists' conduct and actions
Не могу
vis-a-vis themselves?
не
I cannot but note
Не могу не отметить,
I
что
cannot
поездка
but
генерального
note
секретаря
that
ООН
the
в Россию
Secretary
и на
General's
Украину
visit to Russia
подавалась
and
как СМИ,
Ukraine
так
was
и западными
portrayed
политиками
both
в
by
абсолютно
media
извращенном
outlets
ключе.
and Western politicians in a
Так
completely
сознательно
distorted
создается
way. There
впечатление,
is,
что
in this way, a
Украине и
deliberate
ООН удалось
impression created
уломать
that the
Россию,
UN
открыть
and
коридор
Ukraine have
для
managed to entice
эвакуации
Russia
мирных жителей
to
из
open up a
из
humanitarian
из
corridor for the
Азовстали.
evacuation of civilians from the Azovstal steel plant.
Между тем, гумкоридоры
Incidentally,
там российская сторона открывает регулярно.
The Russian side has regularly been opening humanitarian
Открыто они,
corridors
кстати
there,
сказать, и сегодня.
and they incidentally are open today as well.
Проблема в том, что
The problem
оказавшиеся
lies
на
in the
Азовстале
following.
боевики из Азова
The Azov
предпочитают
fighters who are
использовать людей в
at
качестве живого
Azovstal
щита.
prefer to use civilians
Об
as
этом
human
открыто
shields,
говорят
and this
те,
is
кто
openly
оттуда
talked
вышел.
about by those who have managed to
Многие из
flee.
них, вопреки
Many of
лживым
those, contrary
утверждениям
to the
украинских
mendacious
властей,
allegations of
предпочли
Ukrainian
остаться в
authorities, have
ДНР
preferred to
или
remain in
изъявили желание вновь
DPR
вернуться в
or
освобожденный
voiced
Мариуполь.
a desire to return to liberated Mariupol.
А сегодня
And
азовские
today, the
боевики
Azov
окончательно
fighters
сбросили
have
маску,
definitively cast off their
затребовав
masks,
за каждого из
demanding
15 освобожденных заложников
for
из Азовстали
each 15
тонну продуктов и
liberated
медикаментов.
hostages in Azovstal in exchange for every group of 15 liberated hostages for them to be provided with 1 ton of foodstuffs and medicine.
До них так поступали только террористы
Before them,
ИГИЛ и Джабхат аль-Нусра.
only ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists acted in
Поспред
this way.
Албании процитировал сегодня
The permanent
Троцкого,
representative
который
quoted
сказал, что армия — это
Trotsky, of
смех
Albania
общества.
quoted Trotsky, who said that the army is a copy of society.
Вы этот эпизод имели в виду?
Is this episode what you were talking about?
Завтра мы проводим заседание по
Tomorrow we will hold a
нарушению
meeting
Украины
on
международного
Ukraine's
гуманитарного
violations
права
of international humanitarian
по
law,
формуле Арии.
an ARIA formula
Причем
meeting.
рассказывать о происходящем вам
And
будем не мы, а очевидцы тех
it
событий.
won't be us, but
Украинцы и
witnesses
иностранные
who will
журналисты.
describe to you what they say.
Приходите,
The
послушайте,
Ukrainians
если у
and
вас
foreign
есть хоть
journalists, come
малейшее
and listen
желание
if you have an
услышать
inkling of a
объективную
desire
информацию.
to hear objective information. Thank you.
In my role as president of the Security Council, I thank the representative of Russia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, at the outset, let me thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the delegation of the United Kingdom for their able stewardship of the Security Council in April. And I wish the United States success and offer our full support for its presidency this month. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for his briefing and updates on his visit to Russia and Ukraine, as well as for his exercise of his good offices in this conflict. We fully support his continued effort and engagement. Thanks also to Under-Secretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Bachelet and Ms. Luzan for their briefings. As the Secretary General noted last week, civilians always pay the highest price in war. As the conflict moves into its third month, its repercussions have far exceeded many worst-case projections made at the start of hostilities in February. UNHCR now believes that more than 8 million Ukrainians could end up fleeing the country, double the initial estimates. At the same time, UNDP forecasts that the war will soon erase nearly 2 decades of progress in the development of Ukraine. And we have not yet fully absorbed how the impact of this war is reverberating globally, though there are clearly already repercussions being felt through rising commodity prices and supply disruptions, as well as disruptions to the global financial system on which we are all dependent for shared stability and development. We remain deeply concerned by reports of rising civilian casualties and the ongoing destruction of civilian infrastructure. It is imperative to underline once again that all parties must abide by their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This necessarily includes respect for the fundamental international humanitarian law principles of necessity, proportionality, and distinction. The Council has built a framework to strengthen the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including its unanimous adoption of Resolution 2573 just over a year ago. Attacks on civilian infrastructure can undermine the provision of essential services to the civilian population and have horrifying knock-on effects. We appreciate the efforts of international actors to provide tools and mechanisms to operationalize this framework, and we call on the parties to engage in the design of urgently needed solutions, including for safe and voluntary passage. We are encouraged by the recent progress regarding safe passage from Mariupol through coordinated action by the UN, the authorities of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we're hopeful that it can be built upon. However, as we've underscored before, initiatives like corridors do not alter the obligations of the parties to uphold international humanitarian law. The Secretary-General's proposal of a contact group is a welcome starting point to implement additional measures supporting IHL implementation, and we hope to hear more details about the proposal in the near future. As the conflict continues, we join others in emphasizing the critical importance of increased humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and to the neighboring countries hosting refugees. As part of our ongoing support, the UAE most recently dispatched a plane on the 28th of April carrying 30 additional tons of food supplies supporting refugees from Ukraine and Moldova, and we're committed to continue working with international partners on relief efforts. We emphasize, too, the need to systematically take into account needs based on gender, age, and disability in providing humanitarian assistance, not least as it also supports longer-term recovery efforts. Finally, we reiterate that the protection of civilians can only be assured with a cessation of hostilities and a diplomatic solution to this conflict. We call on both sides to remain committed, despite the difficulties, to direct dialogue and for the international community and this Council to create the conditions to help halt the war and ultimately bring about a lasting peace in Europe and stability to our international order. The alternative, increasing polarization and the resulting ruptures, are in no country's interest, neither today or in the future. We must step back from this brink. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vous
Thank you,
félicite,
Madam
Madame la
President.
Présidente, pour
I
votre
congratulate you, Madam
présidente
President,
du Conseil.
for your
Je
presidency
remercie
of
le
the
secrétaire
Council, and I
général
would like to
pour son
thank the
exposé
Secretary
poignant.
General
Je remercie
for
également
his
Madame Michelle
poignant
Bachelet,
briefing. I'd also like to
Monsieur
thank
Martin Griffith
Madame
et
Michelle
Madame
Bachelet, Mr.
Tatiana
Martin Griffiths,
Luzan
and Ms.
pour
Tatiana
leurs
Luzan
exposés
for their
édifiants.
edifying
Nous tenons à
briefings.
saluer la
We wish
hardiesse du secrétaire général
to pay
dans la
tribute
recherche d'une solution pour mettre
the
fin
efforts of the
à la
Secretary
guerre
General
en Ukraine
to find
et apporter une
an
assistance
end
aux
to the war in
personnes
Ukraine and to
en
provide
détresse prises dans
assistance
les
to
taux de combat.
those in distress
Sa
who
visite
have been
récente
targeted in the
à
combat.
Moscou et à Kiev
His recent
et
visit
la
to
mission
Moscow
humanitaire
and
coordonnée
Kiev
par les agences des
and
Nations
the
Unies et le
mission carried
CICR
out by UN
témoignent d'un
agencies and
engagement
the
remarquable que nous
IHC.
soutenons. Madame la Présidente,
The International Committee of the Red
la
Cross
guerre se poursuit en Ukraine
bears this out.
et avec
Madam
elle une
President,
situation
the war in Ukraine
humanitaire en
continues,
constante
and
détérioration.
with it a constantly
71
worsening
jours
humanitarian
depuis le
situation.
début de la guerre,
71 days
les civils
after the
continuent de payer le plus lourd
since the
tribut.
Russian assault on
Les attaques et
Ukraine,
bombardements de
civilians
personnes
continue
et
to pay the
d'infrastructures civiles
highest
sont
price.
également légion. Les pénuries d'eau, les difficultés d'accès aux soins et à l'énergie menacent le
lack of
quotidien
access to
de ceux qui ont
healthcare
décidé
and
de
to
rester dans leur
energy
pays.
all darken
Plus de
the daily
13
life
millions
of
de
those who
personnes
have
ont été
decided to
forcées à
remain
se
in their
déplacer,
country. More
dont
than
près de
30
5
million
millions,
people have been
500
forced into
000 qui ont dû
displacement,
quitter l'Ukraine depuis le
including
déclenchement de la guerre
5.5
le
million
24
people who have
février
been
dernier.
forced to leave
De
Ukraine
nombreuses
since
villes
the
d'Ukraine
outbreak of war on the
sont
24th of
presque entièrement
February.
détruites et les
Numerous
voies de
towns and
communication,
cities around the
à
country are
l'exemple de
almost
certaines
entirely
voies ferrées,
destroyed,
sont
including
les cibles de
transportation
bombardement.
routes. For instance, some
Nous
railways
réitérons
have been
notre
targeted
condamnation de la
by
guerre
Russian
et
bombing.
des
We
attaques
reiterate our
contre les
condemnation
civils
of
et
the
les
war
infrastructures
and
civiles.
attacks on
Nous appelons les
civilians
belligérants
and
au
civilian
strict respect du
infrastructure.
droit
We
international
appeal to the
humanitaire
belligerents to strictly
et à
abide by
garantir le
international
respect et
humanitarian
la
law
protection
and to
de l'ensemble
guarantee
du personnel
respect for and
médical et
protection of
des agences
all medical
humanitaires.
personnel and
Les
humanitarian
infrastructures
workers.
essentielles, les installations
Essential
de production
infrastructures,
et de distribution de
energy,
l'électricité,
gas,
le gaz
drinking water
et la
production
fourniture
and
d'eau
distribution
potable ne devraient
facilities,
jamais
none
être
of
prises
these
pour
must
cible.
ever be targeted.
Nous encourageons les belligérants
We
à
encourage
permettre
the warring
l'évacuation des
parties
civils
to allow
qui
the
souhaitent quitter
evacuation of
les zones de combat.
civilians
À
wishing
cet
to
égard,
leave combat
nous prenons
zones.
note
In this
de
regard,
l'annonce
we
par la
take
Russie d'un
note of the
cessez-le-feu
announcement
et
by
de la mise en
Russia
place
of
d'un
a
couloir
ceasefire
humanitaire
and the
en vue de
establishment of a
l'évacuation des civils
humanitarian
qui
corridor
sont
for the evacuation of
amassés dans
civilians
le complexe
who are sheltering
métallurgique
in the
d'Azovstal à
Azovstal steel
Mariupol.
complex in
Cependant,
Mariupol.
il est primordial
However,
que
it is
le cessez-le-feu
essential
soit
that
effectif
this
et
ceasefire
durable.
be effective
L'onde de
and
choc
lasting.
de la guerre est à présent
The
ressentie
shockwave
par de
from
nombreux
this
pays
war
au-delà
is
des
now being
frontières immédiates
felt
de
in
l'Ukraine.
myriad countries
La pression
beyond
monte
Ukraine's
dans
immediate
de nombreux
borders.
secteurs économiques.
Pressure is
L'incertitude sur
increasing
les
in numerous
livraisons
economic
d'intrants et
sectors.
d'autres produits agricoles,
Uncertainty
de
surrounding
blé, de
deliveries
céréales
of
ou encore d'huile
agricultural
de
inputs
cuisine
and other
est source
products,
d'inquiétude
wheat,
pour
cereals,
de
or
nombreuses
other and cooking
entreprises
oil
et de
are all a
nombreuses
concern
familles dans le
to
monde.
many businesses and
Si la
families
guerre ne
around the
s'arrête
world.
pas
If the
immédiatement,
war doesn't
il est à
end
craindre
immediately,
que la situation
we
des pays
fear that the
qui font
situation
déjà
of
face
those
à de
countries
graves
that are
urgences
already
humanitaires
facing
s'effondre.
serious
En effet,
humanitarian
les prix des
emergencies
denrées
may
alimentaires,
collapse.
des carburants
Indeed,
et
the
des
price of
ressources énergétiques
foodstuffs,
atteignent des
fuels, and
sommets sans
energy
précédent
resources are
et nous en
already
sommes
reaching
déjà tous à
unprecedented
notre
highs,
échelle des
and we
victimes
are all,
collatérales.
on a personal level,
Madame la
the
Présidente,
collateral victims
les
of
signaux
this.
aussi bien
Madam
diplomatiques
President,
que politiques
neither the
ne laissent pas
political
entrevoir un
nor the
véritable
diplomatic
engagement
signs
des parties
point
prenantes
to
à
a
mettre
true
fin à cette guerre.
commitment by
Bien
the
au
parties
contraire,
to bring an end to this
l'escalade
war.
verbale
On the
s'amplifie
contrary, the
au même rythme
rhetoric
que
is
se durcissent
escalating at
les
the
combats sur
same
le terrain,
pace as
des
combat
mouvements
is
d'armes
hardening on
et
the
des visites
ground.
de
We
haut
see
niveau.
increasing flows of
Et pourtant,
weapons and
l'issue
at the
ne
same
peut être
time
trouvée que par le
high-level
dialogue.
visits.
Mon pays appelle une fois de
And
plus
yet, a
les
way out
parties
can
à
only
la
be
retenue et
found
à
through
saisir
dialogue.
toutes
My
les
country
opportunités
calls on the parties
de
to exercise
rencontre
restraint
pour
and to
renouer le
seize
dialogue.
all opportunities
Nous
to
appelons
meet,
à
to
un
resume
engagement
dialogue.
ferme
We
pour
call
le
for
retour de la paix
firm
et de la sécurité
commitment
en Ukraine.
to a
Ce
return to
Conseil
peace and security
ne
in
peut pas
Ukraine.
se
This
satisfaire
council
d'enregistrer les
cannot
morts
content
et de
itself
compter
with
les
recording the numbers
blessés
of dead
tout
and
en
counting the
conciliant les
wounded
contradictions.
while also
Il est
reconciling
primordial
contradictions.
que
It
la
is
fin de la guerre
essential that the
soit
end
le
of the
moteur
war
de
be
toutes les
the
actions
driver
diplomatiques
behind all
qui sont
diplomatic
envisagées
action
par les
envisaged
parties
by the
prenantes.
parties.
Il faut mettre fin à cette
This
guerre
war
le
must
plus
be
rapidement
ended
possible.
as swiftly
Nous
as
sommes
possible.
horrifiés
We
par les
are
atrocités
horrified by
relayées
the
et nous demandons
atrocities
que les
that
enquêtes
have been
indépendantes
reported,
et
and
impartiales soient
we ask
diligentées
for independent,
afin de faire la
impartial
lumière sur les faits,
investigations to be
établir les
conducted to
responsabilités
shed light
et
on the
garantir la
facts
reddition
and
des
to
comptes.
establish
Madame la
responsibility
Présidente, pour terminer,
and guarantee
nous voulons
accountability. Madam
redire qu'il est
President,
temps
in
que les combats
closing, we
s'arrêtent.
would like to say that it is high
Il est
time for
temps
the
que la
fighting to
diplomatie
stop. It is
prévale
time
sur
for
les armes.
diplomacy to
Nos
prevail over
énergies
weapons. Our
doivent
energies
être mises
must be
au service d'un
directed
règlement
at
politique de la
achieving a
situation.
political
Nous devons
settlement to the
cela au peuple
situation.
ukrainien. Je
We
vous
owe
remercie.
this to the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. And before I start, may I thank you and others for your kind words towards me and my team, and wish you a successful presidency. On this subject, I would like to start by thanking the briefers for their statements, and I welcome the Secretary-General's participation in this meeting. On the 4th of April, the Russian permanent representative told the UN press corps that what was happening in Ukraine was warfare, and that in warfare you cannot exclude that civilians are dying. The truth is that it's not just that civilians are dying in Russia's illegal war of aggression, but that Russia is deliberately waging a war designed to terrorize and kill Ukrainian people. Civilians have been executed and dismembered in Bucha and Irpin. No distinction has been drawn between military targets, hospitals, schools, or the Mariupol theatre, outside which children was clearly clearly written and where the latest reporting suggests that as many as 600 people were killed. Russia's actions are clear violations of international humanitarian law, including, but not limited to, resolutions 2286, 2417, and 2573. Madam President, I'd like to make 3 points on the issue of protection of civilians in Ukraine. The first and clearest solution to end the suffering of civilians is for Russia to end its illegal war and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Unless it does so, civilians will continue to die, and many millions more will be put at risk across the globe due to food and energy shortages resulting from the invasion. This is what the Secretary-General referred to as the limitless potential for global harm. Second, while the invasion continues, international humanitarian law must be strictly observed and full humanitarian access to civilians facilitated. We commend the Secretary-General and his team for the efforts that led to the evacuation to safety of about 500 civilians from the Azovstal works. But it should be a matter of profound concern for this Council that humanitarian supplies were not allowed into the city and that the shelling of the steelworks restarted immediately. Third, we're deeply concerned that Russia's war is accompanied by a propaganda campaign, including in this Council, designed to dehumanize and demonize Ukrainians by labeling them as neo-Nazis. This hate speech is extremely dangerous. And as we near the anniversary of the end of World War II, it disrespects the sacrifices of those Russians, Ukrainians, and many other nationalities who fought to end Nazism. Finally, Madam President, I want to assure you that the UK continues its help and support to Ukraine, and today we announced a further £45 million for humanitarian and UN organisations to support the vulnerable and provide medical equipment. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. Let me thank USG Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Tatiana Lussan for your sobering but very important insight into the daily reality of millions of Ukrainians. With a special thanks to the Secretary-General for his briefing and for his recent visit to Russia and Ukraine. You have our strong support to use your good offices in search for a peaceful solution to this senseless, horrific war in Ukraine. Norway recalls that all member states under the Charter of the United Nations have the obligation to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. We support all sincere efforts towards political dialogue, negotiations, and mediation. But it is Russia that has chosen to start an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine and must take steps to end it. President, we welcome yesterday's joint statement by a cross-regional group of freedom of expression mandate holders. We agree that it is precisely during times of war and armed conflict that the right to freedom of expression and free access to information must be vigorously defended. It is instrumental for the promotion of lasting peace, understanding the causes of conflict, and ensuring accountability. President, we continue to be alarmed by the humanitarian situation, including in Mariupol. As you, High Commissioner Bachelet, have highlighted, it seems that international humanitarian law has not merely been ignored, but seemingly tossed aside. Safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need must be allowed immediately. While we are relieved that the safe passage operation to evacuate civilians from the Azovstal steel plant was successful in bringing some to safety, the poor condition of many of the evacuees shows the urgent need to allow for the humanitarian voluntary safe passage of thousands of civilians and hundreds of wounded out of the city. Norway is deeply worried that Russia's intensified hostilities in eastern Ukraine will lead to new besiegement of entire cities and towns, and that the suffering and bloodshed that has engulfed Mariupol may be repeated elsewhere. We call on Russia to immediately end these relentless attacks on civilians. The continued bombardment of civilian infrastructure must also stop. Ukrainian ports must be reopened to allow wheat and grain to reach those in need globally. The crippling impact of Russia's war on the food security of millions is unacceptable. President, there are abundant indications of massive-scale war crimes being committed. These atrocities will not be forgotten. Individuals at all levels will be held to account. There must be accountability for the sake of the victims and all people of Ukraine. We welcome the International Criminal Court and the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine will continue to coordinate, cooperate, and work together with others to investigate possible violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Also, earlier this week, the UN signed a framework of cooperation with Ukraine on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. This is key. This is a key example of positive partnership that the Secretary General's good offices can provide. We strongly support all efforts made to bolster accountability, risk mitigation against trafficking, and access to comprehensive services for survivors. President, I started my remarks today reminding of the obligation of member states to settle their dispute through peaceful means. Russia started this senseless war. Russia must immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its international recognized border. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me at the outset to thank the United Kingdom for a successful presidency. I wish the United States all success in their presidency. Let me thank Secretary General António Guterres for his presence and remarks on the situation in Ukraine. I thank High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and USG Martin Griffiths for their updates. I also thank Ms. Tatiana Luzan for her insights. Ever since the commencement of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for complete cessation of hostilities and for pursuing the path of dialogue and diplomacy as the only way out. However, the conflict has resulted in the loss of lives and countless miseries for its people, especially for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. India has strongly condemned killing of civilians in Bushehr and supported the call for an independent investigation. We support all efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people of Ukraine. India remains on the side of peace and therefore believes that there will be no winning side in this conflict. And while those impacted by this conflict will continue to suffer, diplomacy will be a lasting casualty. We welcome the visit of the Secretary General to Moscow and Kyiv and his engagement with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We agree that the immediate priority is of evacuation of innocent civilians from areas witnessing intense fighting. We deeply appreciate the efforts of the United Nations in evacuating civilian population from Mariupol. We hope these efforts will extend to other areas as well. The conflict is having destabilizing effect with broader regional and global implications. Oil prices are skyrocketing, and there is shortage of food grains and fertilizers. This has had disproportionate impact on the global south and developing countries. We acknowledge the efforts made by the Secretary General, particularly the findings of Global Crisis Response Group Task Team. We welcome the recommendation for exempting purchases of food for humanitarian assistance by WFP from food export restrictions with immediate effect. It is important that similar such exemptions are provided to all member states and relevant stakeholders who are contributing to this global humanitarian effort. The food security challenges emanating from the conflict require us to respond by going beyond constraints that bind us presently. Energy security is equally serious as a concern and needs to be addressed through cooperative efforts. India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors. We are also providing more medical supplies to Ukraine. We support calls for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies, including through establishment of humanitarian corridors. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. We reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. Let me conclude by reaffirming that the contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. I thank you.
The representative of India for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. First, let me sincerely thank the Secretary General for his remarks and for his update from the region. I'm so glad that you've returned to us safe and sound, and I know that you must be jet-lagged after your trip practically around the world, but your being here shows us the commitment that you have to this institution. Also, thank you to Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Bachelet for your remarks. And thank you to our civil society briefer, Tatiana Lazan, for joining us at this late hour for you and for your powerful testimony here today. I welcome the representative from Ukraine, as well as His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister from Poland, as well as other speakers who are here with us today. Colleagues, there are no signs Russia's war against Ukraine is abating. Russia's forces may have abandoned their attempt to capture Kyiv, but Russia continues to conduct missile strikes against Kyiv and terrorize citizens across Ukraine. Independent media reports have laid out a deadly pattern of attacks in the past 2 weeks. On April 23rd, reports indicate Russian missiles strikes killed civilians in Odessa, including a 3-month-old girl. Then Russian missiles hit a thermal power plant, an oil refinery in Kremenchuk the next day. The day after that, Russian forces attacked 5 railway stations across Ukraine. The following day, 2 rockets flew dangerously close to a nuclear plant, posing colossal safety risks to the region. This string of attacks culminated on April 28th, when Russia had the audacity to attack Kyiv while the Secretary General was there to discuss humanitarian aid and peace. Russia has violated the UN Charter. Russia has ignored our unified global call to end this war. The message we continue to hear loud and clear from Moscow is that Russia does not respect or believe in the UN, our charter, and will not be a responsible actor in the international system. Over the past 10 weeks, just 10 weeks, we've seen Russia continue to wage an unprovoked war against a smaller neighbor. We've seen Russia brutalize civilian populations and attack thousands of civilian-used buildings, structures, and vehicles. Apartment buildings, schools, shopping malls, markets, cafes, trams, heating plants, grain silos, food storage facilities, hospitals, orphanages, maternity ward. The list goes on. Russia has lied to this council repeatedly with a wild string of conspiracy theories and disinformation, even falsehood more ridiculous than the last. 3 months ago, Russian representatives told this council they had no intention to invade Ukraine. Now Russia claims the attacks aren't real or never happened. Russia has even claimed that Ukraine is attacking itself, that they bombed their own buildings, attacked their own people, and assaulted their own democracy. These lies defy all logic, all evidence, and common sense. Russia is spreading pure disinformation. The truth is well known. Russia is the only perpetrator of this war. So it's hard to understand while some council members continue to call on all parties to desist. Let's call a spade a spade. Members should call on Russia explicitly to stop its aggression against Ukraine. We have imagery that confirms the presence of mass graves in Bucha, and this is not just an unverified accusation on social media. It is a horrifying fact, one the world must now reckon with. Russia alone started this war, and Russia alone can end it. Silence the guns, withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and embrace diplomacy. Recently, the eyes of the world have been trained on Mariupol, where hundreds of civilians have been taking shelter in a steel plant besieged by Russian forces. We all watched in horror as Russia laid siege mercilessly against civilians trapped inside and underground for weeks. This week, the UN and President Zelensky announced that over 100 Ukrainians have finally been rescued and reached relative safety. And we applaud the UN and ICRC's role in this rescue, and we strongly support the 5 convoys the UN has sent to besieged areas. But we're concerned that attacks on the plant have reportedly resumed with civilians still inside, and we'll be following the situation closely. What we truly need is unhindered access throughout Ukraine so the UN and its partners can reach everyone in need and people of all nationalities can flee to safety. Convoys and evacuations take days and weeks or months of intense negotiation. They cannot be the norm. The only norm we should accept is Ukraine returning to its normal life without Russian forces illegally in its territory, terrorizing and killing civilians, including so many innocent children. Here in the Security Council and at the United Nations, we can help Ukraine return to normalcy. We can do that in 2 ways: by supporting the Ukrainian people and their efforts, and by holding Russia accountable. On the first point, we must address the immediate and dire humanitarian situation, both in Ukraine and outside of it. And for our part, the United States announced this morning at the pledging conference in Warsaw that we will provide an additional $387 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This brings the total we have committed thus far to over $688 million since Russia's further invasion. That money will help our brave partners rapidly distribute food and clean drinking water, sanitation and hygiene kits, critical medical supplies, and even cash to those who need it most in Ukraine. We must also be equally attentive to the way Russia's war of choice is harming countries beyond Ukraine's borders. From the arrival of millions of refugees to Europe, to the global food crisis that is hitting African and Middle Eastern markets particularly hard. I suspect we will hear more details about this from our colleagues who are joining this meeting today. Russia is actively halting Ukrainian agricultural production and blocking the ports that once provided food to those in dire need. While we work to stop this blockade and hold Russia to account for its actions, we will all be called to step up and prevent looming famines and provide more food and funding in the name of decency and humanity. We will focus the attention of this council on this and other aspects of global food insecurity during the open debate we will convene later this month. And second, we must hold those in Russia who unleashed, perpetrated, and ordered the war crimes committed in Ukraine to account. The United States supports a range of international investigations into the atrocities in Ukraine, including efforts by the International Criminal Court, the United for their lives. All of the values the UN holds stand with them and with the overwhelming majority of the international community in defense of sovereignty, of liberty, and democracy. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I would like to again draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Council, I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. At the outset, let me express gratitude to Secretary General Guterres, Under Secretary General Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet, and civil society representative Tatiana Luzan for their briefings. I join all previous speakers in expressing appreciation of a very successful presidency of the Council by the United Kingdom. Last week, the Secretary General visited Ukraine at a time when the country continues to defend the very principles of the United Nations Charter. It was important that António Guterres visited the suburbs of Kiev and saw with his own eyes the horrific war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. I'm grateful to the Secretary General for the clear and unequivocal position on the war against Ukraine as a violation of territorial integrity and the UN Charter. I appreciate the efforts to use the good office's mechanisms for the de-escalation. Every opportunity must be used to achieve peace. On behalf of the President of Ukraine, I would like to thank the Secretary General, the UN team, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, who demonstrated the possibility of making progress and saving civilians from Mariupol, which is blocked by the Russian army. And I quote, "The whole world has learned about the role of the UN and the ICRC in this. This has shown the international organizations can be effective." End of quote. The second stage of the evacuation operation from Mariupol was completed. 344 people were rescued from the city and its suburbs, in addition to more than 150 people who were taken out of Azovstal. There are still civilians, women, children. Therefore, the evacuation operation must be continued. Madam President, Russia has shelled almost 2,000 missiles on Ukrainian cities. Most of them hit civilians, not military infrastructure. Russia struggles to advance and suffers terrible losses. This is the reason why they resort to this desperate missile terror across Ukraine. They want to break us down, but the only thing that will break down in the end is Russia and its capacity to invade, bomb, murder, loot, and rape. Here I would like to recall one of my compatriots, Alexander Mahoff, a well-known journalist in Ukraine, born in the Luhansk region. In 2017, he was the first Ukrainian journalist to visit our station in Antarctica. When COVID came, he was not afraid. He lived in Sanjari, where Ukrainians were brought from China for 2 weeks. From the first day of the full-scale war, he was on the front line, volunteer, ATO veteran, warrior of the 95th Assault Brigade. He was killed in the Kharkiv region in the battles near Izium. He was 36 years old, and my sincere condolences to his family and friends. Russia will bear responsibility for these deaths, as well as for that of every hero who gave their life for Ukraine. Ukraine is not afraid, and the world should not be afraid either. Russia's missile terrorism must be punished and responded to with stronger sanctions and increased military assistance for Ukraine. Madam President, on the 1st of May, the Russian Ministry of War declared that more than 1 million people have been transferred to Russia, including 193,000 children. Most of them, in particular those transferred from Mariupol, undergo filtration camps with mandatory procedures that constitute violations of their human rights, being stripped naked, fingerprinting, interrogation. Eyewitnesses testify that Russian soldiers kill those whom they consider suspicious. There have been multiple reported cases of kidnapping or taking hostage of Ukrainian civilians by Russian troops. There are numerous cases of mistreatment of forcefully displaced Ukrainian citizens in the Russian Federation, including depriving them of their Ukrainian passports and preventing them from leaving Russian territory. We reiterate that all Ukrainian citizens forcefully transferred by Russia must be granted safe return to the territory of Ukraine. Madam President, food security in Ukraine and worldwide appears to be another deliberate target of Russia. As of now, Russia has stolen about 400,000 tons of grain from the temporarily occupied parts of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk regions, a third of all reserves in the regions. Given that the stolen grain was to be used before the next harvest, it has already increased the threat of famine. In addition to stealing grain, Russia attacks grain silos, farming infrastructure, and fertilizer stores, and continues to steal farm vehicles. The looting of grain from the occupied part of Ukraine, the blockade of shipments from Ukrainian ports, and the mining of shipping routes endanger global food security. Russia is, in fact, harming not only Ukraine, but the world population through its illegal actions. According to the United Nations, over 1.7 billion people may risk poverty and famine as a result of disruptions in the food production system caused by Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. Furthermore, Russia continues to intentionally block sowing in Ukraine. We demand that Russia stop illicit grain theft, unblock Ukrainian ports, restore freedom of navigation, and allow trade ships to pass. We urge the international community to strengthen economic sanctions against Russia in order to stop its military aggression against Ukraine, to avert a humanitarian disaster and the world's food security crisis. Madam President, today the State of Israel is celebrating the 74th anniversary of its independence. On November 29, 1947, Ukraine, as a member of the United Nations, voted in favor of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181. The following year, in May, Israel declared its independence. Taking this opportunity, I wish peace and prosperity to Israel and all Jews around the world. As we are approaching May 9, the threat of new provocations and the raising of the stakes by Russia is increasing. In this regard, I would like to condemn the anti-Semitic attacks by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the President of Ukraine and all Jews. Such attacks are absolutely unacceptable. Lavrov could not help revealing the deep-rooted anti-Semitism of Russia's elites. It demonstrates to the world that Putin's Russia is purposefully cultivating Russian supremacy and hatred of other peoples. Russia is already too deeply bogged down in uttering nonsense aimed at justifying its barbaric aggression against Ukraine. In fact, the Russian Foreign Minister questioned the existence of not only the Ukrainian nation, but also the Holocaust. Lavrov deliberately insulted the memory of millions of Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis during World War II. Madam President, at this point, I would like to bring your attention to one of the latest examples of Russian atrocities in Ukraine. On May 4, the bodies of two young men, aged 22 and 23, were exhumed in the village of Rudnya-Talska in Kiev region. On the 25th of February, the Russian invaders shot at a car with them inside. It was not enough, however, for the so-called Russian soldiers to kill innocent civilians. They decided to run over the car with heavy equipment, while the two men were inside. This is insane. This is inhumane. While we are in this meeting, the Russian terrorist practice of shelling Ukrainian cities throughout the entire country with long-range missiles continues. The Secretary General had a chance to witness this practice last Thursday during his visit to Kiev. There was no, however, strong reaction from the Security Council on this deliberate attack. In this regard, inaction of the Security Council and its ability only to express deep concerns continues to irritate the international community, undermine its authority in accordance with the UN Charter, and create an atmosphere of impunity. As it appears, this chamber has turned from a venue of diplomatic debates into a biological hazard site. There is a trail of blood and a sickening smell of smoldering bodies of women, men, and children that a Russian envoy leaves lingering behind him when entering and leaving this chamber. The air that we inhale is filled with poisonous spores of turpitude when he dribbles torrential lies as his lips begin moving. Victory over the Russian army comes closer by the day, as does the time when Putin's henchmen will sit on the bench at a trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Punishment is imminent, and Milosevic will not stay lonely for too long. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Peter Gliński, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council. Let me start by expressing Poland's appreciation and support for the Secretary General's recent trip to Moscow and Kyiv. Each and every effort to restore peace in Ukraine is meaningful. Even if we have to deal with an aggressor who shows very little goodwill and trustworthiness, as demonstrated by the very symbolic Russian shelling of Kyiv during the Secretary's stay in the city. I was also in Kiev and Borodyanka less than 2 weeks ago and witnessed this war on my own eyes. We Poles were very happy to facilitate the trip of Mr. Secretary General and to host him on his way from Moscow to Kiev. Especially so because Mr. Secretary had a chance to meet with the Polish President Andrzej Duda and to stay in the city of Rzeszów, which has become a crucial hub for the delivery and of assistance to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. As President Duda assured the Secretary personally, Poland will not cease to both deliver aid on its own and to be a reliable partner for all United Nations system institutions involved in providing support for Ukraine. The numbers of the needy and the volume of assistance they require grow with every day the Russian aggression continues. Therefore, we all need to contribute to the relief efforts, alongside the growing Polish aid, both for the refugees from Ukraine staying in our country. As you probably know, more than 3 million war refugees have crossed our border during 2 months. And those hiding from bombs in the Russian-shelled cities and towns. Today in Warsaw, Poland and Sweden co-hosted a high-level international donors conference for Ukraine. The event, which was organized in cooperation with presidents of the European Commission and the European Council, was meant to serve as a platform for pledging much-needed additional funds to sustain immediate life-saving humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. According to early estimates, the conference brought $6.5 billion in pledges. Madam President, we are all still struggling to grasp the full implication of this war, but we already know that its consequences go far beyond Ukraine and Europe. Mr. Secretary General has accurately called the damage to multilateralism caused by the ongoing invasion of Ukraine a three-dimensional crisis, a crisis impacting global food, energy, and finance security. The ripe effects of the Russian invasion will be felt in economies and societies around the whole world. International community needs to engage in devising immediate and long-term policies that will mitigate the impacts of this war and contribute to long-term resilience to global shocks. In 5 days' time, on May 10th, some 50 countries from Europe and Central Asia will gather in the Polish city of Łódź at the 33rd session of the Food and Agriculture Organization Regional Conference for Europe to discuss the very pressing issue of food security and agri-food systems transformation. However, we will not solve the crisis of food, energy, and finance without addressing their root causes. These are the crisis of values, was already mentioned today by Madam President, and the crisis of peace. So in fact, we are facing not just a three-dimensional, but five-dimensional crisis. Therefore, the very first step to take right now is very simple. It requires Russia to stop this war and withdraw all its forces from the Ukrainian territory. Once peace is secured, the international community must turn their efforts to develop more effective measures to protect the fundamental values enshrined in the United Nations Charter. They have been trumped by a permanent member of the Security Council, and we must ensure full accountability for violation of international humanitarian and human rights law committed in Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Glinsky, for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. We are thankful to the U.S. Presidency for organizing this meeting. Allow me also to thank the Secretary General, Undersecretary Griffiths, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Bachelet, for their insight remarks and their immense efforts. Also, Ms. Tatiana Luzan for briefing us. Madam President, it is the consequences of Russia's continuing military aggression against Ukraine on civilians are dire, especially in Mariupol and near the former line of contact in Donbass. Greece has a particular interest for the Mariupol area, home to a centuries-long established Greek community of more than 120,000, a productive part of the local societies. Alas, these people, along with so many other civilians, families, women, children, face the horror as Mariupol lies almost entirely destroyed. This is why our consuls in Odessa and Mariupol, demonstrating unprecedented courage, strength, and altruism, stayed behind and carried out in total 6 operations called Nostos, the Greek word for homecoming, for the evacuations of Greek citizens and diaspora Greeks from Ukraine. We have repeatedly called for an immediate ceasefire and for the swift operation of humanitarian corridors. It is of utmost importance to scale up humanitarian operations by enhancing the supply chain capacity and providing targeted humanitarian assistance to people affected. The recent evacuations in the Azovstal plant and Mariupol, achieved thanks to UN persistent efforts, demonstrated in the most obvious way that when there is a will, there is a way. We hope to see more initiatives like this taking place. Greece has been actively engaged in providing humanitarian assistance. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nikos Dendias, himself spearheaded one of Greece's assistance operations to the historic city of Odessa. At the same time, we all witness the huge wave of migrants this war has provoked. Greece is showing solidarity to Ukraine as well as to frontline member states, welcoming thousands of refugees from Ukraine. Madam President, the amount of devastation and destruction is inconceivable. Greece remains engaged in the reconstruction of Ukraine and will be present in coordination with our partners in order to do everything possible to bring back these two cities to the previous state and to facilitate the diaspora Greeks' return to normal life after this tragedy. Our Prime Minister has already announced that we are ready to rebuild a maternity hospital destroyed by Russian shelling in the city of Mariupol. In the same vein, Minister Denias has reiterated our support for the reconstruction of Odessa. There can be no peace, no reconciliation without accountability. We will continue to actively raise the issue of Mariupol in all fora and emphasize that the perpetration of war crimes should be thoroughly investigated. Only peace can bring an end to this immense tragedy with far-reaching repercussions to the world over. We commend the recent visit of the Secretary General in the region and his efforts towards peace. We stand firm in our call for dialogue and diplomacy to prevail. Greece, a pillar of stability in the region of Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, reiterates its unwavering commitment to international law and the UN Charter. Refraining from threat or use of force is the guiding principle underpinning our Charter. We are steadfast in our support to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as of every UN member state. These are fundamental norms of international relations. Their violations, no matter who they target, are threats to us all. There is no room for exceptions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. I thank the UN Secretary General António Guterres, High Commissioner Bachelet, USG Griffiths, as well as the OCHA and NGO representatives for their insightful but sobering briefings. We appreciate the Secretary General's important visits to Kiev and Moscow, in particular, his humanitarian plea and engagement, which have resulted in very practical, life-saving humanitarian action on the ground, notably in Mariupol. We also positively note the close cooperation between the UN and the ICRC in this regard. In the future, the UN should build further on this, although limited success. Unfortunately, these achievements are far from solving the tragic security and humanitarian crisis caused by the Russian aggression. Moreover, many more people remain trapped in the Azovstal iron and steelworks complex, in conditions that humanitarian workers have described as hell. Yet, it has been again under heavy fire from the Russian airstrikes. We call on Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and allow safe evacuation of remaining civilians trapped in this complex. We also call on all relevant UN mechanisms to maintain their focus on the situation of civilians affected by the Russian aggression in Ukraine, especially on the rescue and evacuation from the areas of persistent hostilities. Madam President, it has been more than 2 months since Russia, a permanent member of this Council, launched its aggression against Ukraine in grave violation of international law, including the founding principles of the UN Charter. Russia has persistently ignored the calls of the UN General Assembly, as well as the order of the International Court of Justice, to cease aggression and to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. We strongly condemn Russia's contempt to the UN court, Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, as well as the involvement of Belarus as Russia's accomplice. Russia's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has triggered one of the fastest growing displacement and humanitarian crises on record. Over 17 million people inside and outside Ukraine now are in the need of humanitarian assistance. 7.7 million people are now internally displaced, and more than 5 million refugees have fled into countries neighboring Ukraine and beyond. 90% of refugees are women and girls. They need urgent humanitarian assistance, a cessation of hostilities and safe passage, including through the creation of humanitarian corridors to allow those who wish to do so to leave voluntarily to the destination of their choice. In this light, we are concerned about the reports of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, including children, forcibly moved to so-called filtration camps and then to the territory of the Russian Federation, often unaccompanied by their parents. Madam President, Russia's denials, deceptions, lies, disinformation, war propaganda, incitement for violence, and dehumanizing language against Ukrainians do not change the fact that Russia is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other violations of international humanitarian and human rights law against the civilian population in Ukraine. As underlined by the UN Secretary General, those directly responsible for these war crimes and violations on Ukrainian soil must be held accountable. There will be no impunity. There will be accountability for this horror, and international justice will be done. The Baltic states will continue to steadfastly support all efforts to ensure independent and effective investigations into crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we were among the first to refer the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and we will continue to support the Office of the Prosecutor in its investigation concerning alleged war crimes and war crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. Madam President, the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine is reaching beyond Europe. Millions of people globally are already on the brink of famine, and Russia's invasion will further exacerbate the negative impact on global food security and prices on the world market, therefore increasing the threat of hunger to many countries. Ukraine is the world's 5th largest exporter of wheat. However, the shelling and bombing makes it almost impossible for Ukrainian farmers to sow. On top of this, Russian Federation is blocking hundreds of ships filled with the wheat in the Black Sea. 20 million tons of grain from the last year's harvest have been trapped in Ukraine due to Russia's blockade and bombardment of Odessa seaport and the military closure of the sea lines in the Black Sea. This is the result of the Russian aggression and not sanctions or anything else, as Russia's propaganda suggests. We call on Russia to unblock Ukrainian ports to restore the freedom of navigation, and we encourage the Security Council and the relevant UN agencies to consider the ways to ensure the safe passage for grain-carrying ships from Ukraine's territorial waters to the Black Sea. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's interventions by the Secretary General, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights confirmed the extraordinary gravity and the multidimensional character of this senseless war. This is at the same time an unprovoked military aggression, a blatant violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council, as well as a humanitarian and human rights crisis of dramatic proportions. From a political perspective, we cannot but reaffirming the fundamentally illegal nature of this war, which violates the prohibition of the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of a sovereign country, the obligation to settle disputes peacefully, and the prohibition of targeting the civilian population. For this reason, while we reiterate once more our unwavering support for Ukraine's full independence within its internationally recognized borders and condemn the Russian military aggression, we appreciate and strongly support the diplomatic initiative taken by the UN Secretary General with his recent mission to Moscow and Kiev. Let me reaffirm our conviction that we need to take urgent steps towards peace, in the words of the UN Secretary General Guterres. Achieving a wide and sustainable ceasefire would be the first of these steps. Madam President, from a humanitarian perspective, the conflict in Ukraine is not only fueling one of the most severe humanitarian crises in Europe since the World War II, it's also exacerbating a global food security crisis. Italy renews its call on Russia to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance and to allow the export of crucial Ukrainian agricultural goods in order to alleviate also the challenges faced by numerous states of the global south depending on these products. We also strongly support the Secretary General's proposal for a humanitarian contact group composed of Russia, Ukraine, and the UN officials. Italy has stood by Ukraine and its people since the beginning of this crisis with general budget support, loans, and support of the humanitarian activities carried out by the UN system and the Red Cross in Ukraine and the neighboring countries. However, as humanitarian needs continue to increase as we speak, we are evaluating additional humanitarian initiatives in terms of funding and in-kind donations. Madam President, from a human rights perspective, this aggression is dramatically affecting defenseless and innocent civilians, including those in most vulnerable situations, such as women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities. As documented by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed densely populated areas. This is unacceptable, and we strongly advocate for the establishment of safe passages for the evacuation of civilians.
And I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the Secretary General, Under-Secretary General Griffith, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Mrs. Lausanne for their insightful briefings. Further, I want to thank the Secretary General and all UN staff for their tireless efforts to minimize the human suffering in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Germany strongly supports these efforts. We were relieved about the successful evacuation operation from Mariupol. The people remaining trapped need to be safely evacuated as soon as possible to the destination they want to go to. Excellencies, in a few days, the world will commemorate the day when the Second World War, unleashed by Nazi Germany, ended. 77 years after this watershed moment of world history, Russian propaganda tries to create an outrageous link between the truly heroic fighting of the Red Army, including many Ukrainian fighters, then against the Nazi regime, and the Kremlin's current aggression against Ukraine. This apparently aims at creating a completely alternate reality in which Ukraine's president leads a failed state that needs to be denazified. This utter nonsense is beyond cynicism. The whole world can see what so-called Russian liberation looks like. The pictures from Mariupol, from Irpin, and Bucha speak for themselves. These mass atrocities and crimes against humanity have to stop. The perpetrators must be held accountable in accordance with international law. To this aim, Germany will contribute to the International Criminal Court with additional funding and secondment of experts. Meanwhile, the German Federal Public Prosecutor General has opened structural investigations, preparing the ground for indictments on charges of war crimes. Even if Russia again tries hard in tomorrow's area formula meeting to impose its narratives on the world outside, it will not succeed in altering reality. Rapes, torture, and killings will be brought to the fore. The ones responsible will be brought to justice one by one. Madam President, millions of peoples are fleeing from attacks, from bombing and shelling. Germany has so far recorded more than 600,000 refugee arrivals, and over 90,000 Ukrainian children are attending at least temporarily German schools. It is children that suffer the most from Russia's war of aggression. Their schools are being destroyed. These kids' peaceful lives have been disrupted. Many had to leave their families behind. All this and all they want is to go home and return to their beloved ones. In this connection, reports about the Russian parliament planning to ease rules for the adoption of Ukrainian children are extremely concerning. We will follow this ideologically motivated motion with extreme scrutiny and hold Russia accountable for its deeds. UN agencies as well should play an active role in this regard. The war in Ukraine has dramatic consequences on humanitarian crises in other parts of the world and on global food security. Russia ravages agricultural potential in Ukraine, while at the same time preventing grain exports by blocking the Black Sea, and absurdly tries to blame Western sanctions for increasing food prices. Currently, an estimated 4.5 million tons are stuck in Ukrainian ports, and the Ukrainian representative here in this meeting has reported that Russia has stolen tons of grain from Ukraine. With the expected delays of the next planting season and shortages of seeds, we are standing on the brink of an unprecedented global food security crisis. Germany is strengthening its humanitarian response, especially through WFP. We are also committed to putting global food security high on the agenda, among others in the upcoming meetings of G7 foreign, development and agricultural ministers. The German government has also already announced 430 million euros in additional funding for the crisis response outside Ukraine. This is additional to the means we have been able to pledge for Ukraine, including in the Warsaw Conference. My message to the countries economically affected by the repercussions of Russia's war of aggression is, you can count on our support. The food security crisis proves that the war transcends the borders of Europe. A permanent member of this council is trying to annex new lands by force. If we allow Russia to set a precedent, who will be next? Which former empire will feel encouraged to attack its weaker neighbor, justifying this by a distorted notion of history? If we do not want to open floodgates for recolonization, the world must stand united in rolling back Russia. We once again call on Russia to stop its aggression immediately. Russian troops encounter fierce resistance, not only from the brave Ukrainian military, but from a huge bloc of states that stand up for the UN Charter and the rule of law. Continuing the senseless war will only lead to more bloodshed, and it is never too late to change course. Russia must withdraw its troops, now and for good. The upcoming Day of Liberation that we all commemorate will provide an excellent opportunity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.